Well, I'm very pleased that the truth is available, at least in some place on the internet, in terms of what's going on in the zeitgeist, in terms of what's going on politically and psychologically. That Sam Vaknin's latest video on Covert Borderline is really a wonderful, condensed ideological sort of insight from a psychological perspective, and he makes some of those links as well. And the latest podcast by Bret Weinstein and his wife, the DarkHorse, that latest podcast is let me try to remember the name of that podcast. It was something like Sleeper Cells and a Horizontal Revolution. I'm not sure if Horizontal Revolution was in the title, but it has the phrase sleeper cells in it, which was a wonderful recapitulation of and a condensing of their overarching themes of what makes this. I would call it a fascistic ideology, and I've given lots of my psychological um, readings of what it is, which Sam Vaknin I think now has essentially given a more stable name, which is covert borderline and covert narcissism, which he says are the main constituents um, of that kind of activism, of that kind of groupthink, as it were. Um, uh, Now I've already given my take on these issues. I really have. But I wish that I could produce a more um, thorough summary of all the salient sort of toxicity in some sense, and I will probably try to produce a diatribe that maybe emphasizes some things that about the internal bad faith, as it were, in the structure of Covert Borderline. But there are also some just pure psychological notes that I should elaborate from the last recording that I made, which I made right before I went to bed, and I was already quite tired, and it sort of devolves quite badly at probably the latter half of that recording. Uh, but I think I made an important qualification, and then I sketched out some other things which are also kind of just important ancillary notes, but that I probably should try to emphasize and clarify. And so obviously, because I'd only described this from a hybridized ideological version of covert borderline, Sam Vaknin's rendering of a natural psychological covert borderline um, is different from the hybridized one. I think in the hybridized one, in some sense, you can't tell if it's, and maybe it's true also of the natural covert borderline, that you can't tell if the seat of consciousness is in the subconscious or in the inner child. And in some sense, the inner child is sort of scaffolded and straitjacketing the ego function, and that is a and that sort of fixed tether between the two, that fixed alignment in some sense, which in some sense gates the ego function, and that gatekeeper resides in the inner child. And I don't yet know exactly how to describe that. That starts going into much deeper issues in some sense, that because the inner child is innately very close to the core of the false ego complex. It's very close to holding it is the prominent or the prominence that the whole ego, um, the whole false ego complex is centered around in some sense. Um, it is the first landing, let me not make stupid analogies, but anyway, it is the first sort of time that the invading force touches ground on the continent is the inner child. And the belief structures are, you know, have to have an internal structure, just even to have an inner child, just to have a working machine that is the inner child. And then how that machine works is what essentially gives you a naive or implicit sort of subconscious realm that starts to coalesce and envelop that inner child. And then essentially when the inner child is willing to sort of trust and stabilize um, the subconscious in such a way, then the subconscious, being more directly acted through, produces access to an ego function, a third space, um, which then has indirect, complicated dynamics with the ego function. That would be the ordinary process of false ego development. And the covert borderline, in some sense, has got a weird kind of preemptive armistice with the ego function, which just stops it, which just sort of halts it in its tracks in some sense. And it becomes an added or a padded subconscious milieu. It becomes a matrix overlaid on the subconscious, which the covert borderline is immediately experiencing as a kind of emotional overlay. They talk about this as the lived experience. And Professor Dyson in one of the I hate that person. He's like a covert borderline, perhaps a natural, perhaps a hybridized ideological one. Who knows? But an utterly toxic fascistic persona. If you ever, this is someone who would have been in the inner circles of, in the as part of the intelligentsia that helped to credit the fascistic movement, in Nazi Germany or in Weimar Germany. That's the role that he plays. Um, and psychologically, he needs to be part of this groupthink. He needs to be part of this collective fabric, as it were, because that is that is a pseudo intellectual overlay in some sense. And that pseudo intellectual overlay, they have direct access to it as their sort of autistic subjective, um, uh, uh, in some sense, it's like the block against the ego function as it exists as a belief structure in the inner child is like a shovel or a pickaxe, and they use that pickaxe to excavate access to this covert knowledge, to this arcana, which they are like the mages of, and they are the magic wielders, and they are the I can only use sort of the KKK imagery. They are like the grand dragon wizards, or whatever they call themselves. They are the keepers, of this mythology, and the pseudo intellectual emotional mythology, which in some sense, in order to make their emotion be the source of information, to be the source of this arcanum, they have to meld their emotion into a collective matrix category, which becomes the den of the lair of the subconscious, which becomes a fabric, which sort of becomes the moral authority, the external moral authority, the externalized sort of currency of which they are the keepers of that of that domain. So they are carving up the world in the image of this matrix, which they are the regents and the field marshals and the identitarian and essentially the problem is that you can't really prove its efficaciousness unless you're willing to throw somebody else under the bus. It has to be targeted. Only becomes cohesive in the mode of persecution. Then it proves its power. It proves its self efficaciousness to the collective entity, to the collective identity, which they are the guardian of in some sense. So they are somewhat embodying the Führer principle. They are the savior of their identity. They are part of the Führer machine, as it were, as a loose principle until the principle. But sadly, the principle, is embarrassing and from its own vagueness. But okay, that's an ideological ancillary issue. But which is why there's often a kind of a great yearning to intellectually inculcate it into a functioning role, into a political thing, where essentially you kind of get a disgusting form of political totalitarianism, where there's this weird kind of pact where this person is sort of taking on in inverted commas, democratic function, but that part of that democratic function is that they become the paternal they become a paternal force on culture itself, that they are given the political and this is the same way that these natural covert borderlines and perhaps the hybridized ideological covert borderlines get from their emotional matrix into a kind of into leveraging that emotional matrix into in some sense they've got their brittle sort of fake subconscious morality, and they have to find a way to make that subconscious morality the most important immediate concern of everyone. So essentially they do that by this narrative or mythology, which is a kind of constant hysterical emergency, this constant sense of necessity, that don't think about it too much. Don't try to use your ego function to analyze what's going on. The ego function must be locked away, and it's a virtue to essentially bind your ego function into this dominion, which is pervaded by these grand dragon wizards. Professor Dyson is a perfect example of this. This is a fascist. If you ever saw one, in terms of his cultural influence, in terms of his ideology, in terms he's a poster boy. You can just see visions of Weimar Germany 1920s. And if you haven't noticed the parallel between race and gender studies and Aryan studies, I'm sorry, but your mind is just far too corroded by the brittle pseudo intellectualism of this disgusting creed. Okay, so okay, let me just try and now address this to Sam Buckman to some degree. So the issue that I was trying to sort of take him to task for, because I think almost everything that he said cannot be disagreed with, and in fact, it is really a magnificent summary. It just lacks that one detail, that one detail, one elaboration in some sense that, and it was in some sense just because he didn't qualify what he said. He just needs to add a qualification. That's all, and that qualification is that the perfection of the emotion that they're aiming for, in some sense, they already have it. They already see them because they can manufacture that perfection subjectively, relativistically, and and Sam Buckman beautifully describes their relativistic uh, proclivities. I guess you just need to sort of imagine that self corroborating sort of he even described the what to call it he made that sort of that sophisticated description that it wasn't confirmation bias, but there is something that becomes like, because it's not, it is something that functions almost on in an objective sense like a kind of preemptive confirmation bias just from the structures themselves. And I try to describe this as a kind of, as the same sort of thematically, that it's very similar to the kind of confabulation that narcissists peddle, but in some sense this kind of confabulation of the covert borderline, in some sense, I mean, I would just describe it as bad faith, in some sense. But in some sense, when that bad faith becomes culturally condoned and it's not actively suppressed, like in a healthier form of culture, where you've got normative values that essentially shine a light on that kind of inconsistency and sort of rule it out preemptively, because we have destroyed that kind of societal gatekeeping to some degree. They have stormed the gates and manned them, and now they control the gatekeeping, and therefore their brand of bad faith becomes the sine qua non of what even allows you to operate. You're not even allowed to do anything unless you do it with their blessing, unless you do it with their sanctification. And that is the kind of horizontal revolution, I would say, that it's the pure psychological it's the takeover from the psychological, from this psychological beast, as it were, that makes beasts out of people, that brands them with identity, that marks them with the mark of the beast. I'm sorry for the stark archetypal imagery, but sadly, it is exactly deserving or deserved. And in some sense, this is actually, it's, and I just want to describe another aspect of them, because this is another way of showing them, is that they're, how they browbeat people, and how they use duplicity in some sense, in an open form of sort of manipulation, because they are a representative of a collective morality. They're not representatives of their of just themselves. They're representatives always of a system. That's how they gain their strength. And they're the kind of word games and semantic, sort of convoluting that they get involved in, um, to sort of to duck the individual responsibility of making sense, or the actual, sort of, that they don't have to be reasoning actively. They're not holding themselves up to that standard, because their ego function has just been completely thrown into the sausage machine of their subconscious self-deluding sort of weird thing that's almost like confirmation bias, but isn't exactly confirmation bias, because I think it's more active bad faith than confirmation bias. This is what Jordan Peterson was always describing and outlining, in some sense, that their resentment, that they are culpable for their resentful creed, as it were. That it's not just sort of ignorance, an innocent ignorance. It's more nescient than that. Um, and I think I also sort of cover these themes in my recording that says something about nescience and bad faith, or something like that, where I'm commenting on Bret Weinstein again. He's making very amazing content. Anyway, what was I saying? That they actively attack people's ego functions. They actively try to effectively get them to be what I've called hybridized histrionic, in some sense. Um, and I need to also attend to declaring. I think I'm not going to drop the term hybridized histrionic. In some sense, some of the description of histrionic doesn't match up to my description of cerebral histrionic, but it does, but it doesn't. It's sort of, it's more nuanced. It's actually far too different to probably keep the same title, but I can't think of a better title. But in some sense, there is a sense of assumed intimacy uh, with the histrionic. In some sense, the cerebral histrionic is imagining a world. The hybridized histrionic that I've described, in some sense, is the perfect pedant of the covert borderline, is the perfect sort of commensurating sort of teammate and team player on the wolf tribe in the groupthink. They run together as wolves in some sense, and the one is just a kind of is not of the same ilk as the leading as the leadership sort of occult, sort of Dyson types, Professor Dyson types, um, but is not in the same leadership sort of position as the covert borderlines, but they expect to have their ego function curtailed. In some sense, I think that they might structurally be exactly the same as the covert borderline, but they do not have a deep foot in let's say, the scaffolding. They have the scaffolding against their ego function, but it doesn't reside in their inner child, it resides in their subconscious. The block against their ego function is um is a constant active uh, uh, um, project that the subconscious is doing by itself. That the subconscious is in its rational alignment of this emotional matrix, in some sense. So in some sense, they are much more obsessed with rational self-consistency, and they are using rational self-consistency. I really hate YouTube that they have banned Stefan Molyneux, because I I used rationality rules' debates with Stefan Molyneux as my example of a cerebral histrionic, and now that example is evaporated, um, because I specifically detailed those debates, and I went into the subject matter to prove my point, and to make further claims. But obviously, well, rationality rules is, who knows if he's a naturally occurring one of these or if he's a hybridized one of these. I think that the histrionic variant of my cerebral description, and my description of histrionic, and my description of the cerebral histrionic, that sort of thing, because it is really rooted in the subconscious, as the, I mean, obviously it needs sympathetic structures in the inner child in order to do this, and there is, in some sense, I guess it is also different from the covert borderline, in that in the covert borderline, in the covert borderline the the inner child and the ego function are um, what was I even going to say? Are welded on both sides to the lockdown on the ego function. Um, that the block against the ego function. Yeah, okay, so yeah, no, okay, so. And then what I'm saying about this histrionic description is that in some sense, there is a one-way block against the ego function, which just exists in the inner child, and it, in some sense, it permits the block of the ego function, but it doesn't sufficiently block it, but it sort of it creates a kind of a necessary condition against the ego function, which the which the subconscious fulfills that necessary condition and makes it sufficient as well, and supply. So essentially, the subconscious in the histrionic variant um, supplies the sufficiency, and therefore also it it generally carries the seat of consciousness. So the histrionic, the seat of consciousness, is is in the rational alignment that the subconscious emotional matrix and that mythology is sort of creating and concocting. And so they are obsessed with that confection. They are absolutely obsessed with confecting that kind of consistency. Um, that rational alignment. And they can do that as a pedant, and they can sort of and let's say the bad faith they can keep unconscious to a greater degree. Whereas the covert borderline, the bad faith, it's sort of they're on both sides of the fence. They're not just in the subconscious. They have sufficiency also. They have a mirror of sufficiency. So they have sufficiency in their inner child, and then they have a reflected sufficiency in the subconscious, which sort of just compounds the situation between the block against the ego function that resides in the inner child. But there is a sufficient block in the inner child as well. And that is what gives them that core to the power. That's what gives them essentially access to the ring of power that they have to rule their identity. That's why they are the leader in some sense, because they have access to one of the rings. And the Lord of the Rings metaphor. And thematically, though, the block against the ego function leads you onto a trail to know that there is actually one ring to rule them all. That essentially that brittle, convoluted ideology, which never gets properly substantiated. They still don't have a proper substantiation for social justice in the philosophy department. They still don't have a theory that actually works. They've got descriptions, but they don't have any grounded system. It's just bullshit. It's just, they've got some ramblings about epistemic justice, and it's absolute utter tripe. Um, okay, moving on. Okay, so that I think is the only difference in some sense. That the histrionic in some sense is almost like the vampire victim, or the person who gets turned into a vampire by a senior vampire, and then they become beholden to the leadership of the older vampire, uh, and so they, because essentially they took on the presence of of that inner child and ego function block. They absorbed that signature, as it were, but they didn't replicate it internally. They just replicated it on the subconscious reflective part. And you can see, for example, in the EFF a video when Julius Malema is using five journalists to interrogate him simultaneously, so that they can also interrupt each other while he interrupts them and talks over them, and relativistically contextualizes everything that they say and breaks down language to such an absurd degree that he can just completely concoct the narrative and contrive it, and can use a black bank to justify all of his unreasonable and pathetic, excuses for rationalizing why he won't have a lifestyle audit, because he said that I've already been audited, so then why not just have another one? Oh well, there's no reason. It's like it's weird, the sort of the going in circles or whatever. Essentially, the self the self contradiction on the level of the ego function is just it's so pathetic, uh, um, but he can get away with it, uh, because essentially, well, he's also pandering, I guess, to his leadership, that I have this paternalistic force, that I have this covert borderline power, and I can make the world in the image of the histrionic, of the hybridized histrionic. I can make the image in the world of the male histrionic pedant to this group manifestation that I am the figurehead of. And they do this essentially by saying, you don't get to have an ego function. You don't get to analyze things. I am the only person who can analyze things. And that analysis is convoluted with my inner child belief structure, and the one hand washes the other. And so they just kind of say, I'm the representative of the moral external authority, essentially. It's a they are modeling, in some sense, a form of idolatry. And if the victim falls for it, if the victim of the vampire bite goes in with this, then they become an underling. They become, and in some sense, many people are an underling of the ideology, but they regard themselves as being sired from a particular vampire. They don't, so that's, there isn't just automatic agreement between these same styles, but many people have fallen already. I think Sam Harris, for instance, has been bitten by a bug on some issues, essentially, and generally you could say that perhaps many people have, to some extent, been bitten by some kind of bug. Usually, it would be hidden in some kind of sophisticated, cerebral, intellectual enterprise, if the edifice of that intellectual project had degraded to such an extent that it was prone to this kind of infiltration, as it were, of this dark and shadowy pseudo intellectual. You need a certain level of murkiness in order to conceal this kind of corruption. Because it does operate as a kind of systemic corruption. You only have vampires operating in your midst if the culture itself has already weakened to such an extent that it has invited them. All the mythology around the vampires, in some sense, is a beautiful analogy for this kind of corruption. And I do think that these are the blood-sucking demons, as a spiritual metaphor. They are illiberal. Their values are fascistic fundamentally, but obviously there are smaller scales of deploying this kind of disgusting. I mean, I'm just thinking about it on an intellectual level. When you are in a department that has been captured by these vampires, you can just tell the kind of the in-group incestuousness, in some sense, of how they keep their externalized authority, that is the ground that they have corrupted and taken, and that ground becomes desecrated It doesn't function anymore. It's opaque. There's no transparency. Just as a contrast, in Revelations, the city of God is described as that the roads are made of glass. Anyway. Okay, and then I guess I want to go over one of the other things that I described, which was, the self-delusion, the dream of the vampire, as it were, of the covert borderline, that becomes a self delirium, a self-imposed delirious inculcation, that in some sense their mythologized environment, which they have overlaid with a matrix of their emotion, which they have a direct, I'm talking about the covert borderline. So the covert borderline is supplying their followers, is supplying their histrionics with that sense of being grounded to the mythos, which is why the KKK so accurately described the functions of some of their leaders as being grand dragon viziers or whatever, because that was their function in the community. They have to provide this mythos, and you can see this happening now in the Democratic Party, and I will say again, you'll see it happening again, because they have always been the party of this kind of occult, fascistic, cultural vampire poison and toxicity, and it is so again. This brittle kind of politics, which is so disgusting, because it will always, I didn't go into the elaboration of the unaccountable political, Bret also described that beautifully in his podcast. Actually, I think he could have emphasized it more, that he did say that it's, but in terms of describing how they are, how they essentially counterfeit political accountability by essentially just providing a kind of virtue signaling mechanism, which allows them effectively to supplement accountable leadership with just sort of attaining the goals of this disgustingly oversimplified ideology. So they get given supplementary targets to fill, and those targets are always amenable to corruption. They always facilitate corruption. It's too easy. Because it's targeted towards a stereotype. Their political interests have become stereotyped, and in the generalization of trying to maximize a stereotype, it's like you've got two vague things that you have compounded together, and so you can always just say, well, I'm intending to achieve that, and therefore everything that I do is morally, has a moral sanctimoniousness which is unquestionable. And you can always just blame your enemy. You can blame your ideological foe for explaining why you failed, and so you're never accountable for your own policy outcomes. And so it's a runaway plutocracy. It's a runaway unaccountable elite. Okay, moving on. Okay, that could be elaborated further, but there's a beautiful example of this if you look at Julius Malema using the fact that VBS was a black bank to say why it should not have been put under curation. And you can just see how the journalist who says, well, curation is to safeguard against and to find out exactly the extent of what's gone wrong, and it can help to remove the corrupt elements, and therefore the bank, if it was put under curation, would have a greater chance of perhaps surviving if if the full extent of the corruption could be completely identified, and therefore the poison essentially could be extracted. And you can, I mean, so that was the kind of overarching point that the journalist was making. And just look how quickly it's just put into a mess of pseudo reasoning and just bullshit from Julius Malema, just literally reframing the context in such a speciously but absurdly, it's not even specious. It's like it's absurd. It's like taking, the credulity gets amplified, incredulity gets exacerbated and escalated in such a pathetic gambit. And essentially, and essentially, if you actually confront that, can you, essentially, and then that's the trigger for the next journalist to interrupt, to think that he can sort of, or she can. In fact, I think, oh, this is going to sound sexist of me, I guess. I think the male journalist could tell that was the game, and he never well, the 22 minutes that I watched, he never interrupted anyone. But the women were more than keen to try to interrupt, to nail Julius on the overt absurdity. And essentially, obviously, if you want, it was an interrogation of the interrogators, helped by the fact that those supposed interrogators were interrupting each other. It's a so not only could Julius interrogate the interrogators, but he could sort of use their own sense of being fractured, while he sits there alone as a solitary source of the mythos, as it were, of he will provide the understanding of all of reality, just accept his diminutive role. Yeah, I'm not describing this as elaborately as I should in some sense, but anyway, let me move on further. Okay, so I was in the middle of explaining something to do with getting to the point of describing how the covert borderline is self-delusional, and I did probably sketch it out pretty well. And it is very convoluted, because it is the idea of convoluting yourself in some sense, in order in some sense, the phrase confirmation bias is relevant, because it's a form of sort of doubling down on representing a form of self-consistency. So it's a form of sort of an aversion to being seen as self-inconsistent on the level of the subconscious. And therefore you kind of get a perverse incentive to generate beliefs that make your emotions more germane, more pertinent, more canonical in terms of reality itself. And so it paves the way to creating an ideological structure, or a general cosmological moral mythos in which subjective relativity is paramount, is a kind of is the prime driver of the system in some sense. And I guess, this leads on to the themes of postmodernism and pseudo postmodernism. But I remember that there was many years ago, when I was like 12 years old. I remember I don't now I'm going to say this and it's going to sound stupid, but Foucault didn't die when he was reported as dying. He I think he lived about 4 years longer or something like that. And this sounds completely crazy. I was in correspondence. Well, I wasn't actually just in correspondence with him. I remember my my anyway. I'm not going to. But I used to argue philosophy with him, and I did actually refute him. And not just by speaking with him, by with the text. I critiqued the overarching structure, and I was right. Uh, and I even predicted a lot of this bullshit. But anyway, I predicted that it was like it was fundamentally a kind of a paradox, and I do think that Foucault was. I I would have to think about it to diagnose him. But he was probably something approximating some of these things. But I think he did. I mean, as great intellectuals often do, sometimes they do represent their personality style in their philosophy, but then they also are capable of articulating it to such a high degree that when it is refuted, when it is confronted, it it helps them see past themselves to some degree, or it challenges their core structures, as it were. And I must say, I mean, at that point, he did not have the energy to reimagine his own internal edifice, as it were, and so it did drain his energy to a large degree, I think. But anyway, this sounds completely. This will sound. Um, uh, like make believe, I guess, to some people. But anyway, I'll move on. Um, what else? Uh, I shouldn't have added that as such a red herring. Okay, so wait, I was just saying. Did I finish the point? The self delusion. Uh, okay, so I was describing that they've got an inner child structure, which then is perversely incentivized, and so let's say the confection of the baked in matrix, which is conducive to comporting them as a vehicle for pervading their emotional certainty as and fabricating that emotional certainty into a form of immediate power, still has to be concocted on the level of the inner child. It's not a it's not a product of the subconscious. It's a byproduct of what the subconscious is already good at, and then essentially the inner child is incentivized to sort of yeah. So I would say that toxic autism and insulation is an independent inner child structure, is an independent inner child belief structure, which in some sense can quite badly decide to sort of um, enable the subconscious by uh, and I think that this is an overt form of bad faith. This is not an unconscious bad faith. I think that, well, I guess it can be both. It can be unconscious bad faith in terms of the inner child, but then in terms of the subconscious, it's just it's probably more easily hidden when in the mode of persecution, when in the mode of standing up for the underdog. That in some sense the moral certainty, if you can just identify more people as the underdog and identify more people as the tyrannical oppressor, then 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 your emotional certainty can give you a an artificial form of self sanctimoniousness and self righteousness, which you can sort of conserve as a pyre, as a kind of the fascists, they love their fire, um, they love burning things. Okay, let me see if I can just try to neaten this up further. And I just remembered something, and this is something that I shouldn't, is not worth me saying because this is off the topic, but it just sort of came to me that I remember I met Fanon, and I spoke to him, and I encouraged him to write a book, and he wrote a book. And Foucault, I think it was Foucault or one of the other ones in France, wrote a foreword of it, and they highly edited the book and they changed the book to conform to their general platform, to conform to this general intellectual edifice. And Fanon did privately feel betrayed, and he never spoke out about it. He did not. He did not make a stink about it. He just let it be. But he did take that as a private indication that in what I was saying to him, and the nuance which was edited out of the book was removed, because it was undermining the general edifice. And man, I don't even remember when that was, but I must have been so young when that happened. He was I just remember him being in a small town, or maybe it was a big town, but it was on a small island or something. It was like it was like I don't even know which country it was. Maybe it was some francophone. What's it called? What are they called? They're not countries. They're like protectorates or something. Anyway, I don't even remember where he was, but it was like in the middle of nowhere. It was really remote. Um, I just remember he was very far away from France. Anyway, the vampirism. I guess what I'm pointing out with these things is the level, the insidious level to which the narrative is crafted by these vampires, and how they have these bloodlines, as it were, these bloodlines of superiority. And perhaps Fanon might have felt betrayed, but perhaps he felt that he was on a lower peg, that he was inducted into it by these others, and so they were, they lose their liberal voices. They all become kind of part of this poisonous tree that has this very rigid hierarchy to keep the narrative, to keep the semblance of the narrative cohesive, and to keep the vampire hierarchy of plutocracy. You know, it's like the ring, the Lord of the Rings. I think I even used that analogy with Fanon. I remember that, actually, describing the Lord of the Rings as the metaphor for how this corruption ideologically sort of works. But I mean, I also used the words that were in their books against them to show their I remember, I think I sought Fanon because I wanted him to make a text that had the qualifications and the nuance that was missing in Foucault. And I even got him, he certainly understood the nuance, and then he made a text, but then it was edited by someone in France. I don't know if it was edited by Foucault or one of the other ones, but and it was just edited out. The nuance was edited anyway. This is not relevant. But moving on. Because there is something to be salvaged about postmodernism, but it's exactly what Slavoj Žižek speaks about. It's a return to modernism. It's there to be explored, so that you understand that you have to make a different return to modernity. You have to return to modernity. That's the function of it. Is you have to understand that that it's a nihilistic pit, and once you go through essentially the living with nihilism that Vasti Root depicts in her beautiful chapter on living with nihilism from Stellenbosch University, a philosophy professor. That you have a kind of epistemic responsibilism that is not grounded in some kind of community, that is not invested into some kind of piece of some dominion or some kind of vampire lineage. So if you read Epistemic Agency by Catherine Elgin is a very good text, although I'm still not made up my mind, because a lot of the sentiments that she gives are very sympathetic with, I think she hasn't quite thought about all the dimensions of the community, as it were. And in the objectification of epistemic agency within a kind of communal reductionism, she has in some sense created a heuristic which is itself an epistemic conduciveness, which is itself a form of epistemic reliabilism, which completely blunts epistemic responsibilism. And I think that she hasn't tracked that quite perfectly in some of the sentiments that she professes. But the core of her moral philosophy, I think, is sound. If you read her paper Epistemic Agency, and that's Catherine Elgin of Harvard. Okay, moving on. Okay, so I was talking about the covert borderline's perverse incentive to create belief structures to sort of commensurate with the emotional certainty that they have. And so essentially, I mean, in some sense, it can be modeled as a similar thing to confirmation bias, but it's not the same. But essentially, it's just an internal feedback between a recognition of what their subconscious has a style of doing, and therefore the perverse incentive to create beliefs that facilitate that activity and sort of elevate it to a to the belief of encapsulating it within an externalized authority or a system of external authority. You could call it even a form of cultural idolatry, but it's not that cultural idolatry or that social idolatry in some sense is a belief in their inner child. It's not the subconscious is happy to receive it, but it's not and in some sense it was made for it, so it's tailor made for it. In some sense, it's a convenient belief system. So they are so it's kind of confirmation bias in reverse, because it's the belief that is convenient, not the confirmation of it. Yeah, so I don't think I have anything more original to say about this. And I think Sam Wagner did sort of touch on this, but what he didn't appreciate was, I guess, just how rotten the belief system could be, was just how weak it could be. I mean, he did say that it could be very bad and delusional, and then also very sharp in other things, and that description is correct. But I guess I just needed him to make more qualifications when he said the perfection of the emotion. That is true on a maybe relative to their subjective thing, that they are perfecting the emotion, or they have perfect emotions. Their emotions are perfect records of what's going on. They're perfect representatives, so that they don't need an ego function in some sense. That's all sort of built into it from the belief side in some sense. But just how, but a better word than perfect would have been ideal, that they have ideal emotions, or their emotions give them ideal impressions or idealistic impressions. And just by switching to idealistic, or idealized, sorry, rather idealized, it should be in the past participle as an adjective. So if they are idealized emotions, they can't err. Well, I mean, I guess they can according to their belief structure, but essentially, if they have this perverse incentive, which their idealized emotions innately gives them, that perverse incentive, if they can just agree with their own belief structure, if their idealized emotions can just find agreement with their belief structure, they've got an internal feedback, sort of mirror echo, a reflection that gets echoed, and between those two things, they have a kind of a capacity of an infinite regress. And this is the doom spiral of toxicity. This is what has been called by some as the purity spiral within social justice ideology. Is that it can in that infinite internal regress, all it has to do is use that rational internal spiral. It can spin, it can cocoon anything. Oh yeah, was a word that I wanted to bring up in connection to this. In some sense, it can be seen that the covert borderline is cocooned by their delusion. That their delusion, in some sense, is not, in a metaphorical sense, it is part of the overlay, but in some sense, in terms of representing its deluding characteristic, it's in the boundary, it's in the outer framing of it. So the frame is a cocoon, and it is a cocoon to insulate their domain. What's the point of me saying this? And the threads of that cocoon are this are this internal feedback, this spiral of rational alignment as well, but also, and so essentially anything can be cast into that cocoon as being made part of the boundary. That essentially, with just enough subjective focus and sort of some immediate legwork, you can rationalize something being something else. You can just interpret reality into having to into rejecting it as being outside your cocoon. So essentially, you can, if something upsets you enough, or sort of rocks the boat, or rocks your sort of your internal locus of control in some sense, or you're being the center of the dominion, you can weave that thing into the cocoon. You can just make them in the out group. You can just make them a scapegoat. Now, this is a bit extreme. Not every, let's say, natural covert borderline would do this. I think in some sense they went unnoticed to a large extent, and in some sense they were not inflamed to the extent that they are in this current cultural environment. That in some sense this vampirism perhaps always existed, and perhaps it existed across many different people, that it was a kind of, it was an unconscious mechanism to a large extent, but now it has become prominent because of the general toxicity and the permissiveness that culture has created around these values, because culture stopped preventing them. They stopped creating normative system. Essentially, this was precipitated because they took over the gates. So if you remove that, then essentially this would still exist, but it would be much more mild. It would be much less insidious and pernicious. It would still operate, but in some sense, it would operate as a form of intellectual immaturity that perhaps someone, if they had it uncovered within them, they could just relent it. But now there is no reason to relent it, because it is the mark of protection in this mafia style vampire empire, as it were, and they are covering each other, and they are trying to facilitate each one of their own, each one of the other's domains. There are 9 rings to rule the realms of men, and there are 6 rings for the dwarves, and there are 3 rings for the elves. It's that kind of. Each has their own intellectual subdomain that they can try to vie for power within that domain. That's how it kind of, in some sense, this is a much more deep manifestation of the Tolkien prophecy, as it were, as of the Tolkien metaphor, than Hitler was. Although we're still in the proto-fascist phase in some sense, where this is the fascistic culture and morality that is being spun. I mean, in Weimar Germany, in the dissatisfaction marches, we mustn't forget that there were many people that marched with the Nazis to destabilize liberal values and destabilize the state and burn things down and demand justice for their identity. And that identity was not just the Aryan identity. There were many people that were incredibly, inverted commas, progressive, and were, because essentially they thought that there could be such a thing as a rainbow Hitler. They wanted a different kind of politics where the electorate was not accountable for the political leadership that they received, that there was a Führer that must deliver justice to their identity. It's a different model of politics. It's a fascistic model, where essentially the culture of the Führer. Obviously, the problem is that you can't have a rainbow Hitler. You cannot serve more than one master, and you can't even serve a single master without destroying the identity, or actually the identity grows as the real people are destroyed in sacrifice to the idea of the identity, the generalization. And I mean, I believe that the SS were actually going to, after, if they did win the war and they did take over the world or whatever, they would have eventually genocided their own people that weren't that was the vision of the SS, that the Aryan race had its own internal caste system, but you can't kill your own people when you're in a war. But essentially, what's the point of having these people who aren't true believers? And then you always are sort of the purity spiral, um, that the SS did have plans to, and this that's why they'll always have to have this purity caste system or whatever. They always have to have an ongoing civil war. It'll never end. It doesn't. I mean, I guess if you could put Nazi Germany into a historical counterfactual and run it on a computer simulation with like real AI that simulates human beings, it would be very interesting in some sense, because it on some level it would have been interesting to see the depravity and the cultural degeneration generate from Nazi rule. I mean, obviously they were, I think these things they have a way of destroying themselves. Like the Mayan civilization gets addicted to human sacrifice because I think that it might have been the same culture, that kind of that idea of cannibalism. Um, that you can redistribute this kind of cosmic status, and that you can excavate it from your emotional witch hunts and scapegoating. Um, in order to fulfill the cosmic mythology, and the fatalism and the moral fatalism, essentially, that becomes the overarching. I think it's inexorable that it manifests into a kind of occult sort of thing, um, a weird kind of esoteric spirituality that has this weird kind of moral fatalism. Because even if you have everyone on the same page that agrees, that goes along with the groupthink, that belongs to the totalitarian one-party state or whatever, how do you justify that one person gets more than another person? You have to make a fatalistic story about that. Well, it was fated that they should enjoy that. And in some sense, this has a thing to do with gender as well, because this is almost like the female hypergamy relationship to sexual competition and the sexual marketplace as well. That essentially it is ironically, I think, a reactionary movement of anti-feminists in some sense. Um, that if you take their equality rhetoric out of what they're saying, what they're actually demanding is special privileges and a new female privilege, because they don't want equality. Um, and and essentially equality of outcome for differential contributions and differential um, inputs. Uh, and they need a systemic narrative to sort of. Anyway, Bret sort of already sort of discusses this thematically when he's talking about the special privileges that are being offered to some under this disgusting fascistic sort of consciousness. I guess I'm calling it fascistic. I haven't seen him say that yet, but no, he did sort of connotate that when he said that this has been used against the Jews. I guess that anti-Semitism propaganda. This has historically been used that way. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop this recording. It's fizzled out quite badly, I guess. But I guess I covered everything that I wanted to cover in my horrible, long-winded sort of way. This is an addendum to my recording. It's quite sad that I guess my style is so unplanned in what I say that it's only when I finish recording that I think back on what I've said and kind of survey it and then analyze it for how well I sort of met my objectives, and then I can see the holes in the subject matters that I kind of gleaned over and didn't properly attend to. So let me just patch up some things so I guess in the example of saying that, like, in less toxic times, uh, when the cultural hegemon was not a covert borderline, or wasn't archetypally run by a style of covert borderline, that somewhat is just expected to hold power in this current zeitgeist, in this, or in some sense, this might be a kind of cyclical thing where it is needed as a kind of for other reasons, for other, in some sense, that how the times cycle themselves as a kind of collective karmic engine or something like that. But anyway, and in some sense, I'm glad that we have this, as pernicious as it is, because it might be a perfect cleansing of this evil, because essentially it allows people to see it for what it is, to see it on exhibition, and we've got records of it now because of the internet. So hopefully all of this memory will be retained. Hopefully people will keep the YouTube videos that are being removed from YouTube, but essentially that it'll be added back to the collective repository of knowledge, and it'll be a better source of knowledge that will protect us perhaps in 100 years' time if this happens all again, or whatever. Or I mean, the last time it happened was in the 1920s, and I guess maybe the 1960s as well. There was a bit of a re-emergence, but anyway, or that was a kind of a preemptive cycle, and then it did another cycle, and then it came back around from the 60s to now, in some sense, because it didn't come to a head and get defeated. Okay, anyway, and now it's in its most virulent sort of strain, and hopefully we will ideologically overcome it, although my country is probably the one in which this form of fascism is most likely to actually hopefully the silent majority will have better sense than getting into this corrupt politics, and this disgusting form of confected political consciousness, and cultural corruption of morality and stuff. But anyway, so talking about that, perhaps this as an element will always be in the population to some degree, right? And when I said that, maybe it would just be milder if they didn't have the kind of the mark of power, as it were, and be the gatekeepers of everything, sanctioning only their similar style of engagement to practice anything, and to lay the foundation of any project. And so that's how the horizontal revolution is taking over. But in some sense, if it existed in a milder form, and I've described it, that it would come across as a kind of intellectual immaturity, and then perhaps if it was specifically uncovered, it would be automatically relented, it would be retreated from, it would be sacrificed, and it would be surmounted, it would be worked out of the system, because as an error, because it is an error in conception, it's an error in so many things. It's almost like a self-fulfilling confusion. It's a self-perpetuating, self-promulgating confusion, and convoluting of the issue in order to keep that confusion seemingly to hold a currency that needs to be continually minted and expanded, and otherwise take over. But if it is relented, then in some sense in that milder example that I give, perhaps that's because that was never a virulent strain. That was a um, that was not a covert borderline. That was a a histrionic, a cerebral histrionic, as I've described it. That was someone who, in some sense, were so enamored in a kind of subconscious rational consistency and self-consistency of aligning all the rational facts, and they couldn't see the wood from the trees, and then as soon as they do see the wood from the trees, they remove that kind of that virtual straitjacket between the inner child that has placed a block on the ego function. As soon as they see that that internal move has been made, and they've sort of enlightened that general move is like a bad move, um, of a sort of an intellectually incoherent internal structure, then they drop it because they have broader scope from which to see things from. Um, they can, as the histrionic variant, they can see a different way of being in some sense. But I guess it depends how acclimatized they get to the rational alignment, because essentially that's technical sweetness of um, of being able to sort of harness an easily apprehended form uh, of industriousness of and at it is so, if they get subconsciously in some sense so acclimatized to that sense of the sufficiency of that overarching project, that essentially they don't want to give it up. They don't want to give up that mode of operating. They don't want to give up that formula. And essentially the internal concession to them is not, they can excuse it with more beliefs. They can excuse it with just a certain type of rationalism, a certain kind um, a certain brittle form of pathetic and vague epistemology, um, that sort of just disperses its accountability into a kind of narrative, into an external locus of control, into an external authority, to an idolatry. And so, in some sense, worldly idolatry, in some sense, is the biggest excuse for continuing to perpetuate the histrionic form of that sort of bad faith. And then when you encroach upon it, they give you a practical complaint. They don't give you an actual defense. They give you a practical complaint. They give you a kind of dilemma. They say, if you take this from me, you have to replace it. It's like, take a penny, leave a penny. It's like you can't just abscond and remove this and leave me with nothing. You have to leave me with something, and and the something that you leave me with must serve the same function as what this serves. And that is the kind of, let's say, that's the hopeless, self-entrenched cerebral histrionic. Um, and in some sense, it's because they have, in some, perhaps in some part of their life, they have witnessed a covert borderline, and they have said, this self sanctimonious self righteousness is the hard edge that we must strive for, is the sense of certainty that is possible, is a form of mental clarity or something like that. So they've seen a vampire and they've said, I want to be immortal like that vampire. I want to achieve that sense of anyway. But yeah, but it can go either way depending on the culture in some sense, or depending on the individual. I mean, actually, this is not, it's not just environmentally bound. This is actually, I would say, the wellspring in which a culture takes on its character by the individual members that make it up, and essentially their overarching general propensity to choose, let's say, between the side of external authority, um, and these, epistemic conduciveness. I mean, this is the primordial sort of thing that Catherine Elgin is pointing out in Epistemic Agency, in her paper on epistemic agency, that there are two paths essentially. There's epistemic conduciveness and reliabilism, and epistemic responsibilism, and these people, they don't want to be a responsibilist. And even many of these people, who I would argue aren't responsibilists, they are truth. They have these symbols of truth conduciveness, but because they're about generalizations, because they're about groups, because they're about stereotypes, and then they see their self-image is combined with that group image, or with that group identity, with the stereotype. It filters their epistemic responsibilism, and I don't even know why they call themselves epistemic responsibilists. They're fascists as far as I can see, or they're vampires rather. They're covert borderline sort of entrenched vampires. Okay, so there's all of that. Was that everything I wanted to say? Wait, what hole did I just plug? I just wanted to clarify that. I think I just clarified like 3 minor points, I guess. And I did explore this in my last recording, but I just want to touch on it, I guess, for greater emphasis. So I do think that in some sense, in structural terms, you can only go so far, and I think that the structural terms that I've went into are pretty deep, as it goes. But in some sense, there is another model to model this issue, which would be kind of more metagram and less four sides of the mind model, in which, and this has to do with essentially the death and the lust, or the two grievances that self-corroborate each other. Oh, and there was another point that I wanted to make about corroboration. About, yeah, okay, well, this is actually this related to the same point. So, saying that the inner child itself is constructed, its belief factory, what grounds its beliefs in a persistent substrate, which is the false ego, which is the substrate of the entire false ego itself, is made up of two grievances: the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil, the death and the lust. And they are both vague. They're both fragment. They're both sort of conjectures, and they stabilize each other into a false binary, into a false dichotomy, and that is the primordial soup of the false ego complex, essentially. And essentially, what I think might be happening in Covert Borderline, and also virtually happening, although not, let's say, that directly, but virtually, this signature has been imprinted by a histrionic, by a cerebral histrionic, or my description of histrionic, which in some sense, okay, so in some sense the histrionic, okay, yeah, this is an important qualification to make. So a normal, clinically diagnosable histrionic assumes intimacy with people. In some sense, my idea of a cerebral histrionic is constantly assuming intimacy with the person that gave them the imprint of their inner child, straight-jacketed ego function. That their inner child has scaffolded and blocked their ego function, and that particular signature of that imprint, so they've been bitten by a particular vampire, and so when they are dealing with anyone, they are reimagining the intimacy that they had in contradistinction to that vampire bite. So in some sense, they are in the intimate space of that original siring vampire. Okay, so you have to understand that, and this is how the Führer principle works as well. So the Führer principle is the big vampire, is the Führer, um, is the covert borderline, and they bite the identity, and then the identity ideology gets adopted by these people, by these pedants, um, and they are like the zealots that have an intimacy to the Führer, that have this transfixion, um, and are enamored with the paternalism that the Führer uh, provides to the narrative of their identity. Okay, so this is the kind of the hybridized histrionic variant in some sense, but there are also other things in which people see an idea, they see a way of being modeled to them, they see something that looks like a covert borderline. Like it might not be an actual covert borderline, but they see a picture of it, they see an illustration of it when they're 2 years old or 3 years old, and they get imprinted by it. They get seduced by that tactic, by that strategy, and they bite themselves with seeing the strategy. They get, essentially, they mimic the strategy that they see depicted, and so that would be the natural variant of the ideological fascistic hybrid. But it's much the same sort of animal, but essentially seeing it depicted like that, in some sense, means that they are, if they're not actually bitten by someone who's actually forcing it on them. Like, so in some sense, when you see Julius Malema interrogate the interrogators, interrogate the journalists, he is sort of bullying them to some degree. He's bullying their ego function. He's actually impressing his unilateral control of understanding itself, and saying, you can't understand things. I understand things for everything. I understand things for the cosmos. I am the central pillar. Um, I define reality. I unilaterally define reality. Um, with my emotional compass is unerring, and so I can just semantically create confusion and convoluting, and it's all consistent because I say it is. And he's trying to sort of bully them into a confection of relenting to that kind of abrasion and attrition that he is wrecking on them for not already conceding to his sort of innate superior role in the narrative. Um, anyway, Julius Malema is an identitarian, a fascist ideologue in South Africa. Anyway, but I'll provide a link to that interrogation. Okay, so what was I saying? So if you are directly bullied by the covert borderline, and then sort of they get their way, they win against you, and you lose, then in some sense you're at a crossroads. Do you realize that you've been bested on a practical level, and then try to sort of do the same thing, to try to outcompete them, to try to sort of, if you can't beat them, join them? Or do you sort of realize that it's bad faith, but sort of swallow the bad faith and just sort of go along with the ride, and sort of you have this sort of this fallen subconscious that then needs to be adopted by an overarching sort of protective counter narrative. So in some sense, it's like you don't join them, but you join the other team. So because that one bullied you, you find one just like it that's sort of on that's representing the inverse narrative. This is why I've always said that fascists need each other, like the SJW fascists, the social justice warrior fascists. They need real racists just as much as real racists need them. They need each other to uh, uh, solidify their narrative, and to validate the essentially the one is the proof of the one uses the other as evidence of the necessity of its narrative. So they're sort of they help confirm each other's niche, as it were, um, as a as a necessary mind virus, as it were, as a protective covering or whatever. So it's this is why they're called fascists, reactionary, because they are in the image of the thing that they promote. They are the solution to their own, to the problem that they generate. Um, which is also exacerbated by the fact that their policy is so pathetic and unintelligent, and it just sabotages things to such a degree that then they can repurpose their own failure as sabotage by the ideological mirror reflection of their enemy. And so it's a self-fulfilling, self-promoting fire that just gets bigger and bigger. um, anyway it's literally sort of the kind of insanity writ large, as it were, or pathology, unsustainably. Okay, okay. So what I'm saying is that the covert. Okay, so it's interesting that when people see this, there's an alluring, in some sense. I think that people should be blamed for falling for the ideology, because at no point do you actually become entracted into it without actually, let's say, knowingly switching off your ego function and blocking it. And as I said, that this can happen at 2 years old, it can happen very, very young, and it can happen at any age in some sense. As soon as you see a picture of it, you sort of it opens the door to developing this sort of this tactical maneuver. And usually, I think it's usually existed in people that are, let's say, very brainy, very technical in their rationality, as it were, and they have found a way that they can sort of mimic a kind of pretentious form of pseudo intellectualism by being corrosive, by essentially by finding people to throw under the bus, um, because that's how it sort of, it. I mean, you could see this perfectly in the rationality rules' debate with Stefan Molyneux, which I wish was still on YouTube so that I could use that as a very clear example of what I'm talking about. That how sadistically edged it is, and such, and this all. I go into this in great lengths in my commentary on that debate. Um, anyway, but you can see that this is someone who is still basically like 3 years old. This is still someone who essentially who aggressively developed a kind of anti-intellectual charity in order to conserve their narrative, in order to sort of in order to launch specious um, distractions and an enforced convoluting of issues. And a kind of that they sort of they switch around the burden of proof. So it's like that they hold the default criticism, and you have to sort of knock their criticism off their perch. It's that kind of. Anyway, and in some sense, I think that the cerebral histrionic can intellectually recreate the edifice of the covert borderline. They can, if a third person were to watch a cerebral histrionic, or my description of this ideological histrionic was engaged with someone in a debate, you would actually see the presence of the thing that they were emulating. You can actually see a kind of a reprojected hologram of the memory that they were imprinted by to create their cerebral histrionic. In some sense, they're sort of, they're invoking, they're channeling a tactic, they're channeling a strategy, and that heuristic, that is their that is their epistemic conduciveness, that is their idolatry in some sense. They're just they are uh, everything is becoming a duplication of that. It's like Agent Smith in the Matrix. Everything becomes Agent Smith. Agent Smith is like the proto third wave feminist. That's why should he maintain the system and play his part in keeping the system functioning? He should only help a system that everyone is the same as him, where everyone is everyone must get free drinks, because we must remember he's not a human. He's one of the computer side people, but he doesn't like that the computer side people have all these different functions and roles. He wants them all to be the same, and he still wants to obviously take the energy from the humans that are asleep, that power the machines. The vampirism. He wants to sort of have an even vampirism. So in some sense, the histrionic is taking the image, the strategy, the tactic, and the only sort of redeeming aspect that they're adding to it is that it is a model of universalism. It is a model of something that can be scaled up. And so you can understand that essentially Agent Smith is much more like someone like Rationality Rules, and perhaps even like Sam Harris as well. Uh, as a kind of in their species of sort of cerebral histrionic, and sadly I still think that there are a lot of people that have been bitten by some bugs, and they hide these bugs. Sort of, they've been bitten by small vampire bugs, and then they hide these bugs into a kind of universal, into a universal sympathy that they're catering towards, or something like that. Um, anyway, and so those smaller mind viruses have always existed, but now it's sort of, we've got a giant one, we've got a super one that has emerged in the current culture. But okay, anyway, why was I talking about this? So I'm talking about the hybridized thing, and I was talking about essentially how a natural sort of cerebral histrionic would essentially would be someone who imprinted themselves, that bit themselves. They saw something, and then they sort of, it's like, this is a stupid example, but someone's trying to create a radioactive spider and get bitten by it, so that in the hopes of becoming Spider-Man. So it's like Spider-Man got bit inadvertently, not by his own choice, but then someone actually trying to sort of to see a radioactive spider and say, "Ooh, I want that power. Come, let me put my hand, next to its fangs." That's the and in some sense, this perhaps is how superheroes are created. That superheroes are actually inadvertently, or let's say ignorantly, they actually become inducted into one of these mechanisms, but then they wake up to it. They actually wake up inside of it, in the same way that Neo was taken over by Agent Smith. And then inside of Agent Smith, he destroyed Agent Smith. He actually let himself to be assimilated by Agent Smith, and then from the inside conquered Agent Smith and became the superhero that overcame him. And I think that is the, anyway, that's a small sort of aside, but that essentially if you can actually take on the poison and then actually develop your immune system that actually transcends it, that sort of gives you the greater reach and insight into it. Okay, what else? But yeah, so these smaller bugs do exist, and we have been imprinted by them, perhaps when we were at our weaker times, when we were looking for a coping mechanism, when we were looking for something to help as a self-soothing sort of coping strategy in some sense, as a way to insulate the some kind of unholy self-esteem in some sense, or some kind of high status for the inner child to get to confer onto the subconscious, for the subconscious to enjoy, as a kind of perverse incentive. So it's a kind of, again, it's not confirmation bias. It's the reverse of confirmation bias. It's that the belief is that was also a thing that I wanted to neaten up a bit, and just to sort of but anyway, I did accurately depict it in the last thing. The production of convenient beliefs, which, while you are acting out in the rationalization of the subconscious, you can only justify that belief, or you can only justify not examining that belief and making it susceptible to revision, by essentially saying, no, 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 it's so important that I am fulfilling a rational alignment right now, that I am actually continuing, I'm in the doing mode, I'm not in the review mode. So I can't sort of debug this code because I need to finish this task. So you're so stuck in a task in your subconscious that such a hysterical emergency, such a necessity, oh, this is a moral crisis, that you're not allowed to even revise this scaffolding, which is convenient to perpetuating the crisis as well. And so you're locked into the narrative, you're locked into the grooves of this supposed counter narrative. In some sense, you can only really justify being in a narrative if you can label it a counter narrative and say that it's necessary to outsmart the arch nemesis of the opposing something, the opposing narrative. And so, it needs to often, its overarching mythology it has to ground its validity in being a kind of social good, a social necessary, in some sense. That, anyway, but there were deeper levels of this which I moved on from going into, but essentially the deeper level is that the two grievances that make up the inner child, which are thematically redeployed on the subconscious as well, are, even in the inner child, imbalanced. They're imbalanced, obviously, to that one of the grievances becomes a double whammy, becomes double barreled. So and it seeks to encapsulate the other grievance. So actually, you end up with a unipolar grievance. So essentially, I've said before that you're supposed to have a death and a lust. These people, they only have one. In some sense, you can't tell which one it is. It's sort of it's actually is almost like the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics as an analogy. It's like you can't actually tell which one of them is double barreled, but one of them is double barreled, and it's doing the, so essentially they don't have a death and a lust, they just have a death or they just have a lust, but you're not sure which one, something like that. And they've unified their two grievances into a single sort of test, into a substitution, into a belief in some sense, but that belief is not does not have an internal structure, it has an external imposition. So in some sense, the belief can only be articulated when in the mode of a kind of subconscious persecution, when their social mask is persecuting something. Can it only be activated? Can that structure? So they can only know themselves in the mode of persecution. They can only know themselves in the mode of reactionary, in a reactionary sense of self, or in terms of their subconscious. And this is what makes the ego function blocked in some sense. And again, these insights, I don't think you can easily overlay them onto the four sides of the mind, in terms of the detailed model of the four sides of the mind. But anyway, and further insight would be garnered from my metagram model. But anyway, I went into that in my metagram speculative theory video that I made recently. And the subconscious is what am I saying? The subconscious. So the subconscious has that same schism of you don't know which one it's coming from. In some sense, the inner child is is somewhat confused. Is like on a fundamental level, it's like dispersed, and it's only collected by the mythology. So in some sense, the inner child is like a murky swamp. No, that's a bad analogy. It's like a misty. Is very misty. It's like a cloud. It's like living inside of a cloud. And the subconscious is the land of the cloud, the nation of the cloud, the ground that the cloud envelops. And that island, that solid land mass is that's hidden in the mists is uh, has to perform its social functions in that misty um, atmosphere where you can't see more than 1 foot in front of your face, because of that fundamental confusion of the inner child, because you can't locate what you're doing in terms of your own belief structures. The belief structures is just a single connected cloud. It's just like a sort of which becomes the sort of the social environment, which becomes the moral system, which becomes this, and in some sense, the only way to kind of to dignify the cloud as a natural atmospheric condition that is a natural for human beings is you have to kind of dress the cloud with some form of dignity and integrity by essentially making sure that everyone is enslaved into creating the same tower of 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 worship to that nation, to that island nation, to what it means to be them. They have to do some great work, some collective great work that proves this camouflaged existence is the natural human condition, or is a is on the cutting edge, or something like that, or is so they have to do something collectively together that helps distract them. And actually, I would say the only thing that really distracts them, apart from their imagining of creating monuments to their greatness and magnificence, is to actually kill the non-believers, is to cannibalize the people who won't bow to this religion of the culture in the mist of this island. So very convoluted, mixed metaphor, but and this is all operated in terms of the subconscious. The subconscious, this is the what I've just described sounds absolutely, it sounds like a fable. It sounds like a fairy story about the Lost Boys, but combined with Peter Pan, combined with a horror novel. Like, so it's sort of like the Lost Boys and Peter Pan, but it's not like a children's book. It's like the most depraved kind of psychological. There's no level to which uh, the essentially just so that they can believe that they share some kind of cosmic power some kind of cosmic fatalism, uh, because in some sense that misty cloud, in some sense, has to justify itself as keeping the ego function blocked out. So the sun, the rays of the sun uh, cannot reach this gang of vampires because it would burn them, and they need the cloud to protect themselves um, from the clarity of vision that the sunlight would make them see what they are, and they would burn. But the uh, so they need the cloud to keep the sun at bay because they're locked into this mode of activity. I was going to say something. Oh, that the cloud itself though is the block for the sun, and that is its function. It is needed for that function. It is leveraged for that function. It is so the subconscious atmosphere, the feeling body, the social mask of these people is actively trying to block the sun, is actively trying to block the ego function. Um, they don't want meta-analysis. They only want their confected narrative, so-called narrative of meta-analysis, which is the mythology of the cloud, which is it's very loose thinking. It's just a narrative. It's just peddling the same narrative, and so the narrative, the cloud, is the only thing there is, and so you can say, well, the cloud could blow away and you could live a different way, and you could actually be a sun dweller that has the sun on their face, and that lives a different way. But they don't want that because the cloud confects a narrative that connects them inextricably with their surroundings. They feel, in some sense, it is a secular religion. It is a form of idolatry. It's sort of, you could call it the cloud idolatry as well. And I think even that cloud idolatry is perhaps a point of, in a Venn diagram. It is shared. It can be shared by three groups. It can be shared by the covert narcissists. It can be shared by the covert borderlines, who are obviously the leaders of the thing. And the covert narcissists are also, could be helpful lieutenants because they can be more logical. In some sense, they can actually have the two-faced intellect that they can sort of pander to this bullshit, and then they can also try to think beyond it, but then essentially in order to try to gain narcissistic supply that they never properly receive. But anyway, because it goes to their identity, which they don't even fully believe in, but they believe that they have to be a part of something. And then the third component is this histrionic, which is kind of like, which is actually very close to the borderline, the covert borderline, but it's like if the covert borderline, I've always depicted the covert borderline as having a female energy, even if it is, I mean, Hitler, I think, was probably a covert borderline. And Sam Bucknan says that it's mostly men, and I think that is right. I think that probably is, yes, that's in fact definitely right. Just thinking about that covert borderlines are more men, but there are, I actually, well, now I'm thinking about it, when I think about SJW stuff, there are a lot of women as well. But that might be because of the ideology. In some sense, I feel like the women that are covert borderline, they have more the ideological variant of it. So that's interesting. That's an interesting aside. That in some sense, hmm, I'll have to think about that more. But I think everything that I've just said is roughly correct. That when you have all of these these academics in gender and race studies and all the female ones, that these are hybridized covert borderlines. They're the ideologically inducted ones to a large extent, or they're covert narcissists probably as well. Um, it might actually be easier to speak to one of the covert narcissists than the other ones, but you wouldn't get very far anyway because they don't care about, they never believed in the stuff truly to begin with. But so they would never renounce it because it was all just a necessary conduit in order to, they want a kind of, they see themselves as being the kind of the intelligentsia that is destined to rule, and this is the only way to sort of get to install the brains into the totalitarian machine or something like that. Um, many many academics fall into that sort of category. Um, okay, anyway, but yeah, I do think that the women who actually believe this, and maybe they're just covert narcissists. Well, they're all. I guess they are the ideological. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on, like, if you want to, do they really believe it? Like, I guess is that you can do. How do they rationalize that they can't substantiate it from the ground up? You know, because they give themselves the excuse to just say, no, this is an emergency, so we can't think about it. We just have to get in line with the project. That's the sort of their overarching excuse. And essentially, if you push that button too much, if you push that point too much, then they'll just overtly threaten you. It'll just evolve into overt radical violence and overt fascist totalitarian, sort of Gestapo-esque control. Um, and they are probably very capable of establishing sort of Gestapo-like, bodies. I mean, I've seen, I've, I mean, they talk about gang, what do they call it? Gang stalking and things like that, and play. I think that was the sort of the proto form of the development, because of this current cultural phase that we're in, of developing these sorts of these. It's like they're trying to build confidence. This is also why I think a lot of looting takes place to some extent. That a lot of the radicals, I mean, this is what the fascists did. They actually promoted looting to try to raise the confidence of their followers so that they would um, be more complicit with the coup that they dream about. So essentially that it's about getting culture to the point at which that they can tolerate an overt power grab. That you demoralize the system enough and you debase it enough and you bring it to its knees and I mean, it's a process of degenerating the sanctity of liberal values, basically, and completely changing the value and meaning of democracy to essentially just majoritarianism, um, and changing the how law itself is conceived. In I mean, South Africa has already been plagued by this disgusting perversion of our legal theory by even the Chief Justice himself. Okay, moving on. Who's an open ideologue of this identity consciousness, fascism, you know, um, toxic ideology of identity consciousness. Uh, okay, what was I saying? I was talking about. Okay, so that covert borderline is predominantly a male manifestation, which makes actually a lot of sense. But yeah, I just wanted to say that in a naturally occurring covert covert borderline, that their lives could be just as badly uh, could be a real hodgepodge of a lot of things. I guess could sort of have proficient elements and many chaotic. Um, okay, what am I? What was I getting onto? But yeah, I think this is a very important uh, definition of Sam Bucknan, uh, covert borderline. Okay, what was I talking about? Yeah, I think the only thing that he was missing, Sam Bucknan, in his description, and this is a reiteration, is the that internal feedback, which essentially is some version of um, conflagration. Why does that not sound like a real word? I mean, I was going into examples of talking about people being bitten by bugs and things like that. That this happens on a micro scale to some degree, um, and that there's a general choice that structures and orders this structure. Um, which essentially comes from having this muddled, confused inner child, and then that is sort of uncertain because it's got this unipole grievance, this double-barreled grievance, which then is woven into, essentially is the mist that can create a kind of a society of social relations and a culture, social culture, which is projected. Because in some sense, this doesn't mean that you actually have to inhabit a culture that is like this, but this is the culture that exists in the mind of the subconscious of a covert borderline. And in some sense, they have that sort of that they have this disembodied moral. Their affectation is itself a their emotional affectation is to bear down on others this sense of a disembodied moral system. So they are always measuring people up to a moral system, which they are the authority, or which they are the wellspring of it. They are the promulgator of it. And so that kind of that unilateral emotional subjectivity or relativism, if it is, and it is, let's say, naturally going to be confirmed or verified by the inner child confusion or muddling. When I say the grievance is muddling, there are other parts. It'll also have a belief structure that will inculcate that confusion. So when I say confusion, it's not just like a complete confusion, but on that little nugget of how I've in my metagram theoretical speculation, I'm talking about a different model of the ontology of the false ego complex, starting with the inner child. And but in terms of the four sides of the mind model, um, there's still going to be structures, but I'm just saying that those structures will have that confusion about the grievance inculcated into it. So I mean, it's just on a kind of thematic level of interpretation that I'm depicting the subconscious projection, and that it is in some sense that power is sourced from that the confusion of that grievance, because then essentially they can leverage the importance of that grievance, because remember that is my description of the core root of the false ego complex. It's probably wrong to call it the root, because the superego is probably the root, but the core, it is the core of the false ego complex, and that core has been put into a confusion so that the dignity of that core can operate with it, can be animated within the culture, the cloud, which is essentially the atmosphere which the covert borderline is impinging and burdening other people with their emotional affectation. So they're using their emotional affectation. What's laden within that emotional affectation is this moral system, which is importing its certainty, or the core fidelity of the whole false ego system is being extracted from. Um, Now, obviously, there are other structures that facilitate this exporting of that power from the inner child to the subconscious, and that supporting scaffolding would also be a block against the ego function. But I guess it's also keeping that internal grievance deferred, or keeping that internal grievance um, into a state in which it can have conveyed all of its power to the subconscious. And I mean, let me just try to see if I can just imagine something, just so it sounds like I'm not just talking gibberish. So it would be something like belief structures that would say things like, and I'm talking abstractly and therefore fundamentally sort of metaphorically, that it would have to fill this form, but it wouldn't be this particular. Let me see if I can outline it. It would be something like, let me think, how would the subconscious, how would the inner child grievance become a double-barreled, so it's like confusing the lust and the death, but it's also both. So it becomes, so it's like the lust and the death are a super state, or superimposition. It's like a waveform. So would it be something like, this means that? Or would it be like, no, it's like this and or this equals the same? Yeah, so it is a vanity structure. So it's like, um, yeah, so their particular vanity is a I can make it. I can probably make an egregious metaphor, but it would be something like they have a twin vanity that that is they have two vanities. They have one vanity modeled after the lust, and they have another vanity modeled after the death. And then they have a corroboration between the two vanities, or they have a kind of a superimposition of those two vanities. So they kind of whatever the two vanities agree with is undeniable, and whatever overlap doesn't whatever isn't overlapped by the two vanities is kind of jettisoned, is sort of ignored. So I think this is, and this actually is exactly what is in some of my circuit structures. And it's interesting because there are some metagram types that that have the capacity to do this and some that do not. So that's interesting, but that might just have to do with semantics of the engram itself, of the basic engram. But anyway, that aside, um, that the so they have in effect two vanities, and because they have two vanities, there is that pattern of having two vanities is repeated on each other side of the mind, which in some sense, because the vanity exists within the inner child, so they do have a structure of belief in their inner child, but because they have two vanities, it it creates a solidity between them. It doesn't create like an evolving, sprawling city that has to sort of re-engineer its values. It's a very monotone city. It's a very what's the word, minimalistic city that is made by the like the Venn diagram of these two vanities, because they manifest as two separate vanities, and then they have to sort of, only what they agree with gets transmutated in as the basis of the subconscious, and then the subconscious doesn't want to throw too much of that detail out, so it also tries to replicate both and do its own conversion, and do its own convergence, and then essentially that all gets baked, but that the subconscious experiences it completely differently, because the subconscious is a social mask, is a feeling body, that is there to relate to other people. So essentially, so they have two narratives. They're living in two narratives simultaneously, and those two narratives, they can only act on something when the two narratives agree and overlap, as it were, to make their reality in some sense. So their reality is double checked. Um, I mean, I used to talk about this in Metagram quite a lot when I used to say these circuits, when I was talking about bipolar type 2, these circuits perceive twice and they judge once. It is interesting, though, if there is. You see, I've always wondered why, for example, perhaps Metagram types would have any gender biases in them. But anyway, that's something that's an ancillary issue or problem. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to end this recording here, but I think that this is also, these are facets that that I haven't fully elaborated on and described, but these are important facets as well. Um, and I haven't sort of created a stable enough description of what I headlined as what I was trying to just do just now. But anyway, I think I'm going to. My voice is tired, and I'm going to also think about this more. Okay, this is a very important further addendum to what I was just speaking about. So I've thought about it for about 10 minutes. I think it's been about 10 minutes. Anyway, and I've made a lot of connections, and I think I've cleared this up very very nicely. So a natural covert narcissist essentially has two vanity structures in their inner child, and both of those vanity structures it's not nice having two vanity structures, essentially. That imposes certain structural burdens on the inner child overall. Because if you have two separate vanity structures, you have a conundrum, because the vanity doesn't operate, because then you have two separate vanities. Okay, so it's an open question what to do, and they actually have to keep it an open question within the inner child, because if they try to resolve that problem with more beliefs, if they try to sew them into having a single vanity structure, then they have then essentially in that cross contamination, there'll be so much invalidation of the contents in each vanity structure that there'll be almost no substance left. So they have to find a way to essentially to structure those vanities, each of them separately, into being a prospective motivation or intentional proposition to do with the self-image. So they define themselves as a kind of as a well-intentioned self-image, and they don't collect information about themselves, because if they did collect information about what they have done in their belief structure, in their self-image, then their two vanity structures would lose most of their contents. They would lose most of their form. So essentially, it's a dilemma between having a kind of confused form, or it's not confused, but within its structure, it's hard to call it a structure, because the form that it in an elaborated form that it takes, it essentially is just there as a primer to infuse the atmosphere, the two narrative clouds, which will form part of the subconscious. Now, the subconscious is much more is intrinsically just a kind of container which is much more capable of dealing with dissonance, because the subconscious is almost meant to be the bridge between the ego function and the inner child, and it's meant to sort of process iniquity between those two sides of the mind. It's meant to be sort of the troubleshooting diagnostic area in some sense, but now it's being used differently in terms of the covert borderline, the natural covert borderline. So the natural covert borderline then has they have two narratives, they have two clouds that they are in the midst of, in the stew of, which is their culture of the social mask. But they have one judgment on it. They have one social mask, and they have in two clouds. So they have two clouds and one social mask. So the social mask is because it's also the subconscious. It is and I've got this description in my metagram type. If they can be metagram typed, then I can know the emotional tone that will correlate to their subconscious, and then their subconscious will be will be a single response to those two narrative clouds. Now, there's something there's a complicated issue in all of this, which I should have said earlier. That essentially the kind of self-delusion, the kind of confabulation, the kind of inverted confirmation bias that the covert borderline is prone to is better understood as being a form of duplicity, in that essentially the mask can decide essentially to hyper vigilantly focus on one narrative over the other narrative. They can sort of in the privacy of the mist, they can essentially pretend that there is only one cloud instead of the other cloud. So they can jump between the narratives, and they can do so at their convenience. And so that sense of that power of duplicity, in some sense, they will sort of they'll have to they perhaps are a bit of a magician themselves, in that they have to redirect that unaccountability. They have to experience it at a different time, or they have to divert it to somebody else. They have to sort of scapegoat. If they cheat the one cloud and just pretend that they're addressing the context of the other cloud, the missing context then has to sort of be, the one context has to sort of excuse its a monopolization by essentially finding a scapegoat to be the cause of why that was necessary and why the other cloud went unattended to. So the one cloud is constantly trying to counterfeit excuses for suspending the context of the other cloud. And so the vanity itself, I think, will naturally include those kinds of excuse mechanisms, that kind of duplicity. I think might even be the inner child sort of contribution. Might even be there in the inner child, and it's also there alive in the narrative of the clouds themselves, in the social game that is being played. Okay, that's I think that's very important to lay that down. Okay, now there are more things that I need to say. Now, the ideological version of the covert borderline, which I've given examples, I think that, for example, the vast number of women that we see that ostensibly, at least on an intellectual level, are exhibiting covert borderline pathology in their presentment of their worldview or whatever, and their ideological machinations and such. And their political outlook, their cosmological outlook, their philosophical arrangement that supports this disgusting and contrived, corrupt moral system or whatever. How do they replicate this? Because it's hard to believe that they all had these structures. And in some sense, I can't exactly pinpoint, but I think that they don't necessarily have these exact same structures, but they can simulate it. And I think that this is how they simulate it. That this ideological hybridized covert borderline, what it does is it creates a vanity structure in their inner child that basically says, it's very similar to the natural covert borderline, where it says, I won't retain beliefs about my identity. My identity is an unwritten tapestry, or something like, or the identity. They'll have a belief about the identity matrix, that identity itself is an ineffable sort of magic MacGuffin that will just always precipitate, the right answer. That it's beyond question. It's beyond. So there's no point in attacking it too much. And in some sense, how they root this is that they have a belief about the scapegoat. So they have a kind of systemic scapegoat that they can know about. So essentially they restrict themselves to having knowledge, not about, let's say, the right identities, but about the evil identities. They create a kind of, they create their own duplicitous, or they create their own double vanity thing, where they have But it's weird because one of these vanities, in some sense, it doesn't relate to them. It relates to this disembodied, abstract boogeyman, scapegoat. And then they have one, which is the prospective one, which they sort of belong to, which is well intentioned. Whether they be, and in some sense, there might even be an overlap between, there might be a potential overlap that they themselves are white liberals, and so they are white, or they are male or whatever, but they are also, um, and so they have a vanity that it doesn't matter if they're white or not, or if those labels apply to them or not, but they collect knowledge that informs the one narrative, and then they have a separate narrative, which is their well-intentioned prospective motivation as to what to do about the system in some sense, and then that 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 and in some sense, or I mean, in some sense, I mean, what I've just constructed is also a metaphor. In some sense, I think that they only have one vanity, but in some sense, they have a vanity with a ghetto in it. You know, they have a vanity with a district where all the bad people live. So they've got one vanity structure, but it's segregated. They've got a segregated vanity that essentially overarchingly does not contain solid knowledge. Only within the district do they contain solid knowledge about the scapegoat, but in the greater overarching structure of the belief system, they only have motivation. They only have intentionality. They don't have they won't pin themselves down as to believing something about what they are doing other than the intentionality of it, other than the ends in some sense. They won't have beliefs about their means. They'll only have beliefs about their ends, about their objectives. So they restrict their belief system. They restrict their vanity into being sort of an inspirational, motivational sort of thing, which then creates the cloud in the subconscious. And then the cloud again has a similar, obviously the natural covert borderline actually does have two vanities. They actually literally have two vanities to be duplicitous between, whereas the hybridized ideological variant of the covert borderline needs a kind of intellectual preciseness, which the natural covert borderline just naturally already is in the culture of servicing, or is naturally in that state already. So it is actually a different beast. It is a different. It is like on a technical level, it's slightly different. It has a lot of similarity, but it also is quite different. And in some sense, this might also model the difference between, let's say, the natural fascist that can actually issue the what to call it, you know, there's a difference between, let's say, the rattling ideologue and in the level of natural composure, let's say, that Hitler had in deploying his disgusting vision, that is, he was a fish in water. This was his natural environment. It sort of it was a pseudo religion to him. I mean, he literally. I mean, if you just look at his military decisions, which were so pathetic and stupid and fanciful, and fantastical, you can see the level of sort of the self delusion, as it were. Whereas the ideologue variant, in some sense, I think is more characteristic of the USSR type totalitarianism, or Stalin. I wonder, actually. I think Stalin. I mean, it's wrong to paint Stalin as the poster boy of the USSR in terms of its overall psychological makeup. I think perhaps Stalin probably was a natural covert narcissist, maybe. But I would say that the general characteristic of that kind of intellectualism, maybe even the Nazis as well, were I mean, the actual leadership might naturally like to have a natural covert narcissist as the to brand it as as their brand of leadership, to sort of give a sense of fidelity, of ideological fidelity, that they're so that the ideologues can see that there is actually someone who exemplifies the true believer in some sense, that actually can embody the sense of I wonder. Well, I mean, I've basically already said that I think that Hitler was a covert borderline, but maybe Stalin was an ideologue. Was a hybridized one, but anyway, um, in some sense that made him maybe it's the other way around. Even maybe Hitler was hybridized ideological, and Stalin was a natural covert borderline. Because in some sense, I mean, I wanted to just say what I just said, because in some sense Stalin seemed to be more stupid, but maybe it's the opposite. Hitler was overtly much more stupid, and Stalin, although much more ruthless in an unnecessary way, was slightly less stupid, but also still pretty pathetic, because anyway, it's not important. And it just shows you how pathetic you can be when you don't have the ego function cleaning up anything, and sort of and doing any kind of meta analysis. Um, anyway, okay. Anyway, so duplicity, I think, is the and essentially that duplicity can be woven into an internal feedback, which can exacerbate its own sort of stupidity, um, and in some sense can sort of underwrite its own malevolence to a large degree. Um, okay, I can't think of anything else that I wanted to add, but those were all very important features to point out. Um, that essentially also then the hybridized ideologue of covert borderline becomes that model of the vanity is very liberating, because in some sense the vanity was always the vanity in a mature false ego complex, in a healthier ordinary false ego complex, the vanity um, a very young person likes acquiring knowledge, because their vanity is the repository of how they can navigate in the world. It is the knowledge of the world according to the lust. Um, it, it, and it is archetypally depicted as a city, because the city is where all the rich men and the kings and the kings of all the value, the things that symbolize um, uh, the values in the world, um, uh, congregate, and where all the roads lead to the city, and all the trade routes, and all the commerce that essentially it subdues the value of the world, and it collects it, and it concentrates it into its quarters. And the city, therefore, is a working harness of value. It's a working subjugation and domination of all values, and it is the concentration of those values. And it is centered around its basic principle is the lust, which is archetypally represented as the whore of Babylon, which sleeps with the kings and the rich merchants are wroth on the anger. Sorry, they are drunk on the wrath. They are drunk on the anger. They get inebriated by drinking the anger that they get from fornicating with the whore, because the whore sleeps with all of them. And so which one is the king of the great city? No one knows. Which one is the king of the vanity? They just have many kings, and the whore sleeps with all of them, and keeps them vying amongst themselves in some sense, and inebriated on their anger that they get, that the fornication that they have with the whore doesn't satisfy them. It brings them anger, but that anger is what they are, is their drink. That anger is their sustenance. It keeps them intoxicated. They are constantly inebriated and intoxicated by the anger that they get from fornicating with the whore. Okay, so that's the archetypal vanity. Now, the vanity, in some sense, when you're still collecting, when the whore is still collecting the rich men and the merchants, there's still many merchants to more collect. You don't know, maybe one of them will be the king of the great city. Maybe one of them will come and bring order to the city and will make a queen out of the whore. Who knows? Maybe there's still a value out there that can organize this system. Now, when you develop your vanity enough, that idea is lost. That idea is, okay, no, well, we might still find some more values, but they're going to be minor values, and the major ones have already been collected, and there's no order in the city, and the whore is still a whore. So you still need to understand the city, because it holds all the values. It's where all the valuable beliefs are stored. And so it still has to have structure. It has to function, because otherwise you can't navigate anything in the world. It is like the subtext of the subconscious. It is the framing subtext of the subconscious. And in some sense, the subconscious becomes then the medium to actually re-engineering the city to some degree, refurnishing it, or rebuilding it, or revising it, or whatever, if there are problems with it. But in some sense, the city is actually stable. The city gets very stable usually at some point, and the more stable it gets, the more overshadowing it gets. It actually feels bad. The vanity, in some sense, becomes a mark of the grind of work. It is in some sense, it is the antithesis of the idea that the sum is greater than its parts. It is the overt domineering claim that these are all the parts that there are, and everything amounts to just being contraptions made up of these values and things like that. As we are twisted into being combined according to the whims of the whore and the blood that she has extracted, the blood of the saints that cements the bricks of the city, the blood of the living liberty being, the blood of true being, the blood of the true believers, the true believers in liberty and free will, have been sublimated into the brick and mortar of the city. Now, that's just basically, it's been made up of the death of the saints. The blood of the saints represents the death of the saints, which represents the beast, which represents the loss of free will, the loss of liberty, and the imposition of conditioning into the structure of the city, into the structure of these beliefs. Now, Now, the way actually to fully is you should actually complete the city. The city needs to be perfected so that it can sacrifice itself, and it needs to be stable so that it can, so that the ego can sacrifice itself, and the ego can essentially um, eventually renounce it. The ego function can help to to engage the superego into dismantling and renouncing that vanity, but that it has to be stable in order to do that. You can't wage war against a against something that is amorphous in some sense. Now, what the hybridized covert borderline has created a hybridized vanity that is fundamentally amorphous. That most of the vanity remains amorphous. It's just one district that keeps, which is like a ghetto in some sense, that it has a captive of a scapegoat that has scapegoated the system. That is the scapegoat for the entire rest of the vanity, to just have their nice motivation that they can just say, oh yes, well now we're not infiltrated anymore because we have restricted the disease into a district, and we can be separate from them. So now we can be unbridled, we can be free, and we can let our imaginations run wild. So they have unbridled their vanity. Their vanity, their general vanity, has become amorphous, but it only can afford that amorphousness, that sense of pure imagination, which then, as I've described, it creates the subconscious narrative and mythology and such, which is much the same as the duplicitousness that exists. But in some sense, the duplicitousness that exists in the natural covert borderline is replaced by a much more persecutorial narrative of that our freedom of imagining can only be justified by a belief system of systemic oppression. That essentially that little district, that ghetto, that scapegoat, has to be the anchor of this belief about systemic oppression, because under that umbrella, the imagination, the amorphous creativity then is unbridled, but it needs the scapegoat to access it, right? And so they have this dichotomy within their vanity. They have this arbitrary dichotomy, because it's very hard to actually, how do you even justify having that? In some sense, it can only justify it by pointing at the subconscious narrative, by saying, oh, I feel it's the truth, essentially. I mean, that's sort of what it eventually sort of all boils down to. It's like, are you blind? Look at the superficial, look at some superficial conducive symbol to prove that this belief system is the only belief system. So it starts table thumping very quickly. It doesn't have a belief structure to actually back it up. The belief structure is up in the air. It's utter bullshit. It's like what you see in academia when you try to get them to justify their epistemic injustice and link it to social injustice. They don't have proper philosophical structures of these things. They're unsubstantiated. They're loose working theories that require a lot of presumptions just to get going. And essentially those presumptions are all just like, look at the narrative. It's just superficial pointing towards the narrative and saying, no, that is real. You can't say that's not real, or, implied threat. So they can only get away with this by sort of sustaining a state of emergency in terms of the narrative, as if their solution to that emergency is the only viable solution, when it's actually the thing that's causing more of the problem, and they have no ability to see that, because most of their vanity is on holiday, and it's the district, it's the ghetto district that is taking, that's where they are wishing to concentrate the scapegoat. It's the analogy of the ghetto, I'm using that to directly invoke how the Nazis treated the Jews, physically and ideologically. That's what I'm reminiscing of here. sorry, that might be the wrong word. I'm not sure if reminiscing has a positive connotation or not, but that's what I'm invoking. That's what I'm remembering to point out, that is how this ideology functions on an intellectual level, or at least on the hybridized intellectual front of covert borderline. And then I think you have people who are bitten by the vampires. That these people are also forms of vampires, and they create a breed of very brittle pedants of cerebral histrionics, of my description of cerebral histrionic, which in some sense is just like the other side of the coin, because it's very similar to everything that I've just said, because they have that narrative, they exist within that narrative, but in some sense they don't defend the inner child structure, they more just defend the block against the ego function. So they're just like what's the word? They're just like cannon fodder pedants. They're just like mind slaves that go along with any movement because it looks like it's something to be a part of, and it's a way to access high status. It's sort of because they've got this vibrant secondary intellectual dishonest economy, which then it's very easy to interface with that by just going along with the groupthink, as it were, and then you get to be on the right side of history, and this is fascistic groupthink at its most, and then they rationally align that as well, because the subconscious narrative has a pseudo ego function analysis attached to it. It's hard. I mean, it's not really a real ego function, because it can't meta analyze itself. So it's sort of it's stuck in a trope. It's stuck in a single atrophied sort of frame, or in some sense it's not maybe the ego function at all. It's just a rehashing of the inner child amorphous vanity. So they've essentially unstabilized their own vanity, and they've destabilized their own vanity, and so they can't actually. I mean, to me, the biggest sign of this is that they don't have any sense of accountability and responsibility. It becomes a societal systemic medium. There's no such thing as political accountability. There's just accountability to that belief structure. So that confused amorphous belief structure becomes the stereotype and the generalization and the address to send the compliance, in some sense. And in some sense, it's like an idolatry, but it's an idolatry that, in some sense, they don't own the idolatry. They are serving part of this social club, and it's the natural or the hybridized ideological covert covert borderlines that actually hold the idol. They actually are carrying the idol, and then everyone else is sort of feeding them energy, and then they can see that the idol is being worshipped via those priestesses and priests. The KKK title, was like the Grand Dragon Wizard Viziers and things like that, which are exactly the same role that is fulfilled by these gender and race studies academics. These hybridized covert borderlines that I've just described. Okay, so that's everything. Okay, so now, yeah, okay, that's everything I wanted to get through. And yes, it's very complicated, but that's everything it is. Okay, I'm going to jump back in and just go straight back into a slight elaboration and re-emphasis of some important features. So I want to also illustrate the mild version of a kind of societal perversion, or an intellectual cultural Ponzi scheme, as it were, um, as a model on the what to call it, the hybridized covert borderline that sort of can make its home in many a different sort of arenas, and how it can be somewhat secluded and specialized. And I would give Sam Harris as an example of this, that he has a variant of this which is constrained to a particular subject matter, to a particular conceptual subject matter. And in some sense, he probably has two books. He has two sets of books. He has one for the psychological free will and another for the kind of the metaphysical, pure philosophical, but anyway, and I've spoken about that as an individual sort of issue, but essentially how the same kind of hybridized covert borderline can sort of clothe itself in an advanced specialization, and essentially it performs the same. Obviously, if it's specialized and it only, in some sense, it's sort of, it's like, it's not the whole city in some sense, but the whole city is inhabited by a suburb, and that suburb has its scapegoated district. And so essentially the scapegoated district for Sam Harris would essentially be the psychological description of free will, and the suburb would be the kind of the greater. So that suburb, in some sense, is given. In some sense, okay. This is going into this example has forced me to go into complexities and things like that. In some sense, you understand that Sam Harris is actually part of the scapegoated elite, because he is actually trying to be a sort of a secret champion of the scapegoat in that sense, because he actually sort of wants to recover the utility of psychological free will and sort of dress himself in it and sort of be amongst that district within the greater suburb, that he wants to count himself among a kind of oh man, yeah. So okay, I understand that I've created this very complicated metaphor, and it is actually true, and in some sense he is playing both sides. He's on the side of the suburban people, and he's on the side of the psych. He's trying to create a kind of a bridge between the two, but it's like that's a private bridge. It's like a secret tunnel or something like that. That's actually a further complication on the general thing that I want to perhaps depict first. So that you end up having to fudge your own framework. Essentially, all of this stuff requires a fudge, but that's a secondary complication, which I actually don't want to get into depicting right now. But I just want to get the general sort of cultural perversion and how people essentially latch on to a kind of intellectual narrative, because essentially this confected narrative, in some sense, then gives you a freedom. It gives you a because essentially that suburb gets to go on holiday because they've found the proximate cause, they've found the enemy, and they've contracted the enemy into a district. They've sequestered them, and in that sequestration and segmenting, they have branched their intellect. Their intellect, therefore, has an arbitrary segregation imposed on it, and essentially what that segregation facilitates is an inequitable dispersal of accountability. That then accountability gets concentrated on the scapegoat, and the suburb gets to sort of gets to do something in the space that has been seeded by the sequestration, by the concentration of accountability and blame, essentially. And so out of that resource of that blame, they get to engineer something. They get to create something to make a bridge. They get to sort of pretend to make a bridge between the two, in some sense. They can go on this quest to sort of create a narrative that inculcates this because essentially they've got a snapshot of the final of what it needs to look like at the end, but then they just need to sort of complete the story and round all the edges and sort of and spruce it up, so they've got that kind of project to do, to decorate their intellectualism in the suburb in some sense. And so comfortable Sam Harris is in that position, that essentially psychological free will is the sort of is the whipping boy, that he can imagine an educational indoctrination of how maybe he can illustrate to the whipping boy how to be more like him, how he can sort of proselytize better to the sequestrated district that holds all the blame. But you see, as it is a concentration of blame, it's also a concentration of the power of responsibility, of the power of reason, in fact, is actually depleted from the suburb. And so it can only leverage this distinction. It premises everything in this distinction. And this is why you see Sam Harris completely enamored with this distinction, which Bret is not interested in, because he really concedes that psychological free will is as it is thought of is erroneous, but that there is something else that we should still go looking for. But Sam Harris doesn't want to think that essentially that the truth or the break which he needs doesn't belong to his side of the fence of the segregation. That it actually has been relegated to the district that has been scapegoated. That his tower somewhat starts to crumble if the scapegoat actually has a variant within it that actually debunks the whole sort of sequestration. Okay, anyway. Okay, now I've just given an example of Sam Harris. Let me make a more overarching sort of thing that this structure that I've just described is embroiled in many different intellectual enterprises and projects in the academy, for instance, as well, but also in other spaces as well. Lots of philosophies and theories are actually have that kind of narrative baked into them, and when people sort of get imprinted, they see that narrative, they just think, "Ooh, that's really easy. That's really convenient. I'll just sort of be bitten by that bug. I'll be enamored by that, and essentially I can just say, well, everyone else conceives of this subject in those segmented terms." And it's like it's an us or them sort of thing. And you're proselytizing to your in-group at the expense of scapegoating something that helps you vindicate your role as being a field marshal for your in-group in some sense. And it's a form of groupthink. And in some sense, many people are so enamored with that pattern that they will thankfully even just let let that particular intellectual structure be collapsed, so long as it is only replaced by exactly the same type of game, the exact same style of okay, so there's that. That they are just they will only sacrifice their Ponzi scheme in if you give them a new Ponzi scheme to take its place, where they can keep on doubling down against the scapegoat. And sometimes scapegoats, in some sense, it becomes a bit too obvious that the whole vilification and propaganda and the intellectual sort of framework is brittle, that they need to sometimes spruce it up every now and again, and sort of find a new articulation or description of the target of the scapegoat. Anyway, going into all of this. Okay, so anyway, the suburb and the district of the city then is obviously a minor immaturity, is a minor, let's say, immaturity that can be locked into just a one subject within someone's value structure, within someone's belief structure. And usually people have these because they need boundaries in their structure to help guarantee a certain basic level of I guess you could call it a kind of provision that the inner child is making to enhance the life of the subconscious. And this is what I call, sort of intrinsic intellectual dishonesty. Because essentially it's at the expense of the concept of accountability and responsibility, gets sort of outsourced, gets exteriorized. And this is very disempowering. And then it complains about, and it uses its own sense of disempowerment as a leveraging sort of excuse to continue its narrative. And so it's a self-fulfilling sort of thing. And thank goodness that usually, or at least in the past, this would only plague pseudo-intellectuals. This would only plague, the second-rate and the third-rate academics, of which they are the majority, sadly. The vast majority, even. Okay, so there's that. The sophists, essentially, that dignify their sophistry in essentially a groupthink. And essentially they don't want to move away from that pattern, because if they move away from that pattern, it gives them a matrix with which that they can predict and plot things, with which they can sort of have a kind of reliabilism, an epistemic reliabilism that they can sort of fundamentally depend on as the fundamental rubric, which is why I've always thought that Catherine Elgin has never been critical enough of the general academic way of thinking. And in some sense, I guess, she always, I think, justified it as saying, well, these people are scientists, they're not philosophers, and if they cared to look at philosophy, then they would be on my side. And essentially they know that essentially they're playing a game according to their community or something like that. And essentially if they believe that the game is representative of the overarching way that philosophy and metaphysics work, they're just sort of philosophically, what's the opposite of astute? They are anti-astute on that sort of groping. But anyway, but she actually gives beautiful lectures that contain exactly this criticism that I would say that academia in general needs to be at the brunt of receiving. But anyway, okay. The thing that I wanted to emphasize. Okay, so now I've hopefully illustrated how that a version of this hybridized, covert, borderline happens in intellectual spheres, can happen in very particular, it perhaps can even happen emotionally in terms of subcultures, like in terms of death metal or something like that, or I don't know, I'm saying things that, but essentially certain cliques can perhaps discover this collective mechanism that then they in some sense it could be what creates cliques within um, social edifices. In some sense it can be what helps create a sense of camaraderie within a kind of gang or something like that. Um, you know, anyway, and in some sense, when it's just a suburb and a district doing this, it's just a kind of it's more associated with an activity than with their overarching sense of being. But in some sense, if they ethically rationalize that, they can use that activity as a model for the rest of their vanity. So perhaps it could spread, that they could be that way in many different subjects. And so they don't have an overarching identity politics, but they have many, in some sense, this hybridized version could actually concoct itself as a cocktail of many versions of the same Ponzi scheme. And so essentially it's like they have many different ribbons and many different medals and many different medallions and cliques that they are facilitators thereof, that they're part of many communities, knowledge communities, and their epistemic I'm just thinking of some of I think of the rotten element that Catherine Elgin sort of harps on when she talks about knowledge communities, and how that thinking, that loose thinking, has essentially inspired more loose thinking that has founded these claims of epistemic injustice, which I've made recordings just on that. I'm not going to go into that. That's too much of a tangent. Okay. Okay, so that's the kind of the intellectual variant of it, the pure intellectual variant. Now, the other thing that I wanted to elaborate on, the reason why I wanted to do that is because of what I'm coming on to next now. Where have I just lost that thread now? It was something about emphasizing things about the natural covert borderline and the duplicity, perhaps. Is it something about the narrative, or was it about the narrative of the hybridized borderline, covert borderline? I think I wanted to emphasize that the vanity itself, the best way of thinking of it is that it has gone on holiday. It wants to go on holiday, but it can only go on holiday so much as the scapegoat can pay for the holiday. And the holiday, in some sense, is that it just has good intentions. It just has these sort of, it doesn't contain any content that can be used against itself. It just has a kind of a pure intention. It just has this kind of this pure visionary foresight or something like that. It just has this kind of this promise. So essentially the vanity becomes prone to a kind of ideological promise, which is fulfilled by the subconscious narrative. The subconscious narrative and the activity of the subconscious itself, being in that culture, being part of a subconscious social feeling body that is actively in the progress of fulfilling that promise. So essentially, the holiday of the vanity that is paid for by the scapegoat is a way for the vanity to define itself as an open-ended promise or question that it's asking of the subconscious, and the subconscious is promulgating the answer to the promise, and it is in the process of producing the what was promised. It's always in the pursuit of delivering on the promise, and so that is that is that sense of urgent, necessary rationalization in some sense. And the intellectual version of this is much more dry. It's not as emotionally imposing or compelling, but it's rationally compelling that if you want me to do something else, there's nothing else to do. So in some sense, you kind of get this very dry, rational response is like, don't you dare tell me not to continue in this way of pursuit of knowledge, or this way of pursuit of human rationality. And you get this almost the pseudo-religious blind faith kind of zealotry, which is just, this is I'm piecing together the parts of the matrix that reveal reality. I'm reconstructing the truth itself as an external locus of truth, that I am being conducive to uncovering. And if you challenge that, then they will essentially say you have no right to challenge it. You are outmatched. More people are on my side. They play the authority table thumping game, the external authority table thumping game. They have more names that they can sort of flash than you do, and then essentially they say, what are you even trying to do? You're not doing the same thing. You're stupid. And so they've just completely baked themselves into that particular pattern on their inner child. Their inner child is fundamentally fragmented. It's fundamentally fractured. It's fundamentally branched between the scapegoat and this positive promise, or this nebulous promise, or this holiday that the vanity is no longer has to be structured. It only has to be structured in a single district, and that can support the weight of excusing the transposition of the missing structure into the the subconscious urgency to just continue, to double down. Damn, this is not new. Oh, no, there was an elaboration that was missing, and was it about the duplicity? I think I wanted to emphasize something about the natural covert borderline, because the natural covert borderline actually does have two separate vanities. They settle on the solution being that both vanities will promise each other in some cross-purpose sort of way that they will try not to have anything other than promises. So they produce data on promises. They collect data only on promises, on signifiers, on essentially conducivenesses, on epistemic conducive. So they have data completely aligned by epistemic conduciveness and reliabilism, which is also which is something that I could have said also about the hybridized ideological variant of covert borderline. They also have the same epistemic reliabilism, which is quite sickening to think that I know philosophers who call themselves epistemic responsibilists and essentially do this shit. But anyway, it just shows you how easily that they can just rationalize things in their subconscious from the subconscious framework, which just sort of presumes this baked in sort of vanity on holiday. But in some sense, I guess they're looking for an Agent Smith amalgamation or assimilation of the whole vanity. That's their end game, is that there will be an Agent Smith that will assimilate the whole population of the vanity. That is sort of, but they're trying to arrive at it from the subconscious. The subconscious is sort of the experimental laboratory in the intellectual sense, and they're looking for just more collations to make. They're looking for more rational alignments. They want their cloudy narrative to envelop everything that there is to envelop. They want the clouds to spread, and overshadow and envelop everything there is. And they believe that it has the right. If it can do that, then it certainly it's proven that it is worthy to be the sole cloud that we are all tethered by, that we are all that its dominion is vindicated by its ability to conquer. So in some sense, its fulfillment of the promise is the sine qua non of its verification and self-righteousness or self-referencing satisfaction. And so it's a gamble that if they can claim in some sense, the claim never comes, but hypothetically their idea is that, well, if they can claim to have succeeded, then essentially then they were the right adherent, or they were the correct, so it's sort of like there is a bit of bad faith in the subconscious, but it's like, just be patient, you haven't given me a real shot, and that's a secondary sort of narrative, apologetics, essentially. Apologetics for their canonical baked-in thing. I think religion, to a large extent, sort of follows the same intellectual pattern. False religion, blind faith, idolatry in some sense, an idolatry of an externalized, in some sense, to I guess what I'm actually describing when I describe some of this stuff, the mild version of this is actually what I would, I guess, call the cerebral histrionic, because in some sense, the cerebral histrionic doesn't have a stable version of what's going on in the vanity, but they sort of project that onto the ego function, and they project that onto a kind of cosmological narrative. So they've sealed off their inner child. They're completely unconscious of it, and they are just sort of groping in the dark of the universe, of materialism, of determinism, in some sense. So they are literally out of their mind. They have receded from any kind of seat of consciousness in their inner child, and they are using the social mask, this feeling body, essentially, to flagship some intellectual project that is going to allow them to come across some kind of external boundary, which is going to be the proof of a cosmological, metaphysical limit, which then they can model themselves in the image of that they are searching of. But the search itself has already a lot of this that could be reverse engineered to some extent as a self-fulfilling. There are versions of this metaphysically in Catherine Elgin's lecture on Nature's Handmaiden. But anyway, in terms of significant figures and things like that. But anyway, I don't want to go too much. Okay, damn, this is not going very well. I've actually forgotten the main thrust of what I wanted to depict. and emphasize. I did want to make the mild case more clearly. Why did I want to make the mild case more clearly? As just a and then I wanted to contrast that against maybe the natural covert borderline in terms of their in terms of talking about more of the dynamics of the duplicity, because the duplicity, in some sense, I think the duplicity happens on the level of the subconscious, and it's almost like a secondary set of consequences. And the seed of that duplicity in the natural covert borderline is that there are two vanities, and they are not duplicitous against each other. In some sense, they are they are trying very hard to produce structures that corroborate each other to some degree, because in some sense it's like two cities that are completely have a kind of Venn diagram. They are built on the same ground. They're built in the same vicinity, and so they need structures that can be that don't crowd out the other structures. They need a form of structure that could have a separate structure, or any structure sort of cohabitating it in that. So essentially they're just like outlines of structures. They're not filled in. They're just almost like when you see a sketch, a wireframe. It's like the structures are all wireframe, so that they can actually so that you can imagine their shape and their geometry, but there is no actual opaque structure filled in. It's just wireframe, and because it's wireframe, these two cities can literally be metaphorically superimposed and not disrupt each other. And so that forces the building material to be what I've described. And it might be more complicated than this, because there might actually be some structures as well, but essentially those structures at some point must be sort of discouraged or limited, because if they're anything higher than the ground, or anything higher than just a couple of steps or something like that, the roadworks of the city itself will just be the roads will have these grooves crisscrossing, and the roads won't function, because they'll have other structures confounding them and making the ground uneven, and making the arteries of the city blocked in some sense. And so, and in some sense, I think they do have things like that. They do have that kind of basic ineptitude on the level of their vanity structures, because they are almost fundamentally unstable. They just they don't work, which is why the vanity, in some sense, is primed to be abandoned for the subconscious, to have the seat of consciousness essentially directing, essentially imagining with emotion the content of those wireframes, coloring and essentially when you're looking at a whole lot of wireframes that are hodgepodged, when you're going to color them in with emotion, you're not going to color in both structures at the same time that occupy the same ground, that occupy the exact same space, because that'll look like a mistake. So every time you're in that vicinity of dealing with those values, you pick and choose. You have this conglomeration of synthesis to essentially make up as you so wish, and you can reinterpret it the next moment as well. So essentially the structure, the edifice the framework, sorry, rather the framework of context is this like emotional speciousness, essentially, um, because their vanity itself is wired to facilitate that, and um, and essentially the way to actually uncover this is just how dishonest they are with words themselves, just how bad they are with semantics, just how loose it is, just how inconsistent it is and incoherent it is, and how absurd it is. But essentially, as long as that they can hold the chairmanship of the narrative, and they do essentially, because this is all kind of this is all their subconscious atmosphere that they are burdening on others, and trying to weave into their social masks so that they will be responsive to them holding this narrative. It's like it's like those hippie people that have the talking stick or something like that, and it's like they always have the talking stick. They never relent the talking stick. There's no such thing as a two-way street. um, it's always this unilateral, and essentially because they don't have a stable inner child, other people can't, because essentially this is, I mean, when you're dealing with someone, you're predominantly dealing also at a large extent on a metaphysical sort of sense, at a substrate, at a certain substrate. You're dealing with their beliefs. That's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with someone. If you're dealing with someone with any consistency that isn't a psychopath, that doesn't have ego function incoherence or inconsistency, you're dealing with their beliefs. And so if someone doesn't have stable beliefs, or if they have sort of this form of duplicitous belief, um, uh, um, duplicitous belief reliances, sorry, but anyway, duplicitous, you're dealing with mud. As soon as you make a mud sand castle, it sort of it loses its shape, and now they have, and in some sense they can use their mud to force you to deal with their mud, and then essentially because you can't build anything with it, because it just all goes back to slop, it all just sort of gets cancelled out. um, they can exhaust you that way. Again, I guess right now I'm making comments which are somewhat amalgamating some features of the hybridized and the natural covert borderline. Um, but there was another point to be made, I think, about the solitary vanity that is the hybridized covert borderline, that is using this district segregation aspect of the vanity, that they are doing that so that, let me think. Yeah, there was another point that I wanted to add about that. Now I've lost that thread. That it was something about the subconscious, and I don't know. I guess it was an illustration that I wanted to make. But yeah, I mean, I guess I keep on just wanting to. It obviously had something to do with the mild case. Ah, damn it. Hmm. get the hybridized, and then maybe I want to say something about the what I call the histrionic. I think, well, anyway, I'll just emphasize this point again, that the histrionic, the hybridized histrionic, is in some sense always in the presence, always in the lair and the den of a kind of archetypal hybridized covert borderline. And they are in the environment that they see being crafted or maintained or founded by a strategy which they have seen and they respect as being powerful in some sense. And on that power, that gives them the comfort of being able to just be a follower and not have to care about, sort of behind the curtain, behind the Wizard of Oz curtain of the wizard. And they sort of get catered to, but in some sense, there are winners and losers in that as well, or at least in the identity politics circus there is. That only gets stabilized by a very sort of strict narrative that excludes the special privileges for some people and excludes the kind of this weird kind of interpretation of humanity or judgment. Okay. That's not relevant to what I'm trying to get into now. That the hybridized histrionic is in this infinite, sorry, not infinite, is in this intimate space that has been provided by the hybridized or natural covert borderline because in some sense they are the hybridized histrionic is exteriorizing their inner child, using that social picture or that social mask of the intimacy with this thing as their priest. They are adopting this person as their priest for this idolatry religion in some sense. And maybe the image of this priest in some sense is not even a person, but it's a depiction of the tactic itself. It is a kind of, it is an imprint or a snapshot of I mean, in some sense, I think it could be an ego function, sort of transfiction. It could be actually it could be rooted in the ego function. So the histrionic, in some sense, I guess there's a whole spectrum of the hybridized histrionic, that you could have subspecies that that have that kind of intimate thing, and then they actually picture it as an inner child, which somebody else is essentially vicariously connecting them through to by their association or by their activity, by their subconscious activity of rationalization. Or and in some sense that might also be true in even the technical sense, where they don't know a particular person that has exemplified this strategy, but they are robotically repeating a tactic which seems to be a tactic which which for some or whatever reason they have dignified as being a better substitute for their own inner child. That this strategy, in some sense, which in some sense fractures the vanity, fractures the inner child, removes its stability in order to chase after a fairy story in the subconscious of some rational alignment, of some epistemic conduciveness, of some heuristic. So they, I mean, I guess you could call it a kind of symbology or symbolic idolatry or something like that. That they have seen the beauty in some exterior abstract process or task or something like that, and then they have decided, oh, that can be the source of all value, is just robotically reiterating that task, or replicating that task and being in the image of that task. And that's why I call it a symbolic idolatry in some sense. And it might not necessarily be something that is personable as or that seems like a personage. It might be just a kind of inanimate, kind of technical symmetry or something like that, or I don't know, there's something that looks like a process. It might be quite inhuman. It might be an intellectual sort of fragment or something. Or no, it would never be truly, I guess you couldn't ever call it intellectual. It would be fundamentally I don't want to actually use the word that the Hindus use, because I think it's actually wrong to call it material. It's not that it's material. It's that it's more complicated than that. The actual philosophical understanding of material energy in this context, and specifically in this case, is actually that it's a kind of mechanism in the mind which essentially is only governed by deterministic mechanics, and it becomes unaffected by choice. Essentially becomes a task that supplements choice, or that supplements anyway, I go into some of this in some detail when I was talking about when was I talking about free will recently? Oh yeah, oh no wait, I didn't upload that video. I think I made this whole embarrassing video that was based on an argument that I had with someone, and it is all to do with machine learning, and anyway, I use that as a springboard to get into a lot of philosophical issues, and essentially how machine learning is not is arbitrary, is fundamentally arbitrary. That doesn't mean that it isn't useful, but it supplements reason, and it in some sense it makes its conclusions are not answers to questions, because the whole process is a kind of substitution for reality. It's like a bad reality test for reality, and then you're choosing to interpret its answer as being the answer to the shape of the task but the actual formula and form that the task takes conceptually is actually erroneous, because it actually takes certain reductions in which that if you try to make a thought machine an overarching, obviously you wouldn't be able to follow it each step, but essentially if you made an intellectual what's the word that means like summary, when you pre-see, I can't remember that word, but anyway, if you were to sort of model what was happening conceptually, it loses the plot. It actually loses the plot at a certain point, because essentially it actually fundamentally makes a presumption which is inexcusable. It makes an inductive assumption, which is, I mean, I guess you could say it's like it just depends on it just blindly depends on determinism, but not it actually it's worse than it's not even determinism. It's determinism and I think, historical recurrence or something like that. I don't know how to phrase it, but essentially it said it only, like, you have to put a qualification on machine learning, and the qualification is its solution or its suggestion or whatever is only as good as history is as good as, sorry, as the future is as good as confirming history, is the concise way of putting it. But anyway, okay, I did deal with it in a much more elaborate way. I don't know if I've uploaded that, but anyway, that's a sort of a complete sort of side issue. But you see, when you take a task and you use it to supplement reason, then you've literally made yourself a slave to a machine in some sense that okay, now this whole concept is very psychologically relevant, because the only thing that stops anything from being arbitrary is the choice of an epistemic agent. Okay, everything is fundamentally arbitrary until an epistemic agent makes it not so. And then if it makes it not so, it can make it not so unilaterally, but if it actually wants to be responsible in a subconscious community, or as it were, I mean, the only reason why I think we even have the emergence of reason itself, in some sense, is because of its social correspondent, correlate, which is responsibility. Responsibility and reason is the one is just a manifestation, and the other one is, so reason exists in the inner child, and responsibility exists in the subconscious, and that's the link between the two. That's the intrinsic thread of the golden thread, that is also the thread that eventually generates maturity and responsibility. Anyway, and progress within the false ego complex towards its hopeful and happy resolution. Anyway, and development. Anyway, internal development. Okay. So why am I saying all of this? So yeah, this is too much of a tangent, but so you can say that the answer to some machine learning thing is useful, or you can say that it's representative of something, but you're going to have to really contextualize that. Otherwise, it's not going to be justifiable. I don't think you're going to be able to defend that with reason. But you can arbitrarily make something non-arbitrary in some sense, because the epistemic agent is underwriting that. But that doesn't make it true in some sense, necessarily. I mean, or I guess, are they actually underwriting it, or is it overt bad faith in some sense? And let's say the ability to sort of refine that question is an introspective question that people have to hopefully in a mature society, in a mature culture and civilization, that people are capable of wearing their beliefs on their sleeves so that they are susceptible to review and revision, right? That's how real progress actually happens. Whereas, obviously, anyway, why did I go into all of that? That the inner child's elective power to make something non-arbitrary is okay. Well, anyway, that is the basic sort of thread, the golden thread of maturity, in a sense, and that golden thread of maturity is fundamentally blunted by a lot of these things that I've just been talking about. It's fundamentally obscured by covert borderline, by hybridized covert borderline, by the histrionic, the hybridized histrionic, all of them. there is the inner child is not the epistemic agent underwriting the election of non arbitrariness. And instead, you have to have a narrative that has to be founded on a scapegoat in order just to get itself going. And then once it gets itself going, and that can't be questioned, because if you question that premise, then you can't continue to rope in new data into your rational alignment. You can't continue to collate more data because the matrix is grounded by the scapegoat. And that is why they'll never give it up as well. Because if they lose their ability to produce this rational alignment and to continue to try to engineer the answer to the promise that the open-ended vanity is sort of prompting the subconscious to continue the baton of, means that all the hope and energy of fulfilling this promise, which is part of this rational alignment, or this grand puzzle that they're piecing together. And you can see that the analogy with this, with certain intellectual projects and enterprises in certain fields of academics, and there's another point that I want to add about that, is that that's the difference between people that really make progress or not. It's this kind of psychological, or you could call it spiritual maturity, and the people that are actually clever enough to be humble enough about what they don't know, and to actually be engaged in, they have a certain innate or closer calibration of these fundamental internal things, and that's what makes them first-rate thinkers. This is the difference between a first-rate and a second-rate and a third-rate. Anyway, and the people who actually excelled in this had this knowledge to some degree, and then they made sure that their departments were staffed with people that were these kinds of had these kinds of character, of strong character, and that is what made them leading luminary pioneers, rather than just cranking out more things that are just replications of this formula. And they really actually need to find people to vampirize their good ideas and to turn into that more of their rehashed garbage. Anyway, that was a tangent. Okay, so the point about the non-arbitrariness is that their non-arbitrariness is not underwritten by their inner child. It's underwritten by the subconscious unfolding of the narrative, or persecution, the continued persecution. And I mean that persecution. So it's not, or you could say the pursuit of the narrative, which involves persecution, which involves the witch hunts and the scapegoating, which is a mirror of the scapegoating. They're trying to find a scapegoat that matches up with the only knowledge that they have from their inner child, which is knowledge of the scapegoat. They don't have knowledge of themselves. They don't have knowledge they don't have any belief structures. They are just this kind of their vanity is on holiday. Their internal belief structures are on holiday. So they don't have the structure in their vanity to be accountable to their own belief structures, because the only part of it that still exists is just the target of their persecution in the narrative. And so their narrative is dictating to them what is not arbitrary, and therefore the narrative can essentially cherry pick itself into a kind of confirmation bias. It can never be wrong. It can always just reinterpret the facts. And this is why you get this crazy kind of inconsistency, this crazy kind of incoherence. that essentially, it's rules for me but not for thee. It's these double standards that are so pathetic and disgusting, and they just keep on doubling down and on themselves, and it just never ends. Okay, so anyway, that I think is the last point that I wanted to make. That the elective power of the inner child gets supplanted by the subconscious narrative, and so you actually have this robotic, automatic, horizontal revolution, as Bret Weinstein aptly named it. So grateful that that I have these other people in the world who are standing up against and describing with such acuity the depravity that we are embroiled in, but and the degradation, and are fighting against it. It's surely needed in these dark times. It's like it's literally the plot of the Lord of the Rings. Okay, I guess that's everything I wanted to emphasize.